CD4.
King Wenceslas's hopes of becoming Holy Roman Emperor, like his father before him, came to nothing. Instead, the prize went to his half-brother Sigismund, who was elected King of the Romans by the Imperial College. Nicknamed the Ginger Fox, the red-headed Sigismund was a far more energetic and stable figure than Wenceslas. As Emperor-elect, Sigismund's most immediate priority was to repair the schisms in the Church, and in 1414 he persuaded Pope John XXIII to convene a Grand Council of Reconciliation. In the autumn of that year, hundreds of cardinals, academics, abbots and bishops from all over Europe converged on the tiny German lakeside town of Constance. Their sacred task was to reunite the Church under a single pope and to bring the Hussite rebels to heel. Sigismund invited Jan Hus to come to Constance and argue his case. Hus was deeply worried by the invitation. He feared if he left Bohemia, he might never return alive. But Sigismund gave him an assurance of safe passage, and so on the 11th of October 1414, Jan Hus set out from Prague on horseback, armed with a bundle of tracts that he intended to read out to the assembled prelates. As he passed through German towns and cities, people came out of their houses to get a glimpse of this Bohemian troublemaker. Hus was riding into a trap. While still on the road, the Council of Constance convened and resumed the heresy trial against him. Sigismund's guarantee of safe passage was countermanded, and 3 weeks after his arrival in Constance, Hus was arrested and imprisoned in a cell next to a cesspool, while his accusers prepared their case against him. Even then, Jan Hus still hoped he would get a fair trial. But at the hearings, he was not permitted to make statements and was ordered to confine himself to answering questions. The proceedings were noisy and chaotic. When Hus tried to explain himself, his accusers shouted at him to give up his legal hair-splitting and to answer a simple yes or no to the charges. Hus was invited to recant his positions, which he said he would do quite happily if the council could produce a better instruction from the scriptures. This provoked mocking laughter and verbal abuse. Hus was then asked to renounce several positions that he'd never held in the first place. He refused, saying they should not ask him to perjure himself in the eyes of God. Hus now gave up all hope of a fair hearing and readied himself to die. Stephen Palech, a former close friend turned enemy, came to see him in his cell one last time. Palech pleaded with Hus not to think so much about the shame of recanting, but of the good that might come from it. Hus asked him what he would do if he was asked to recant positions he'd never held. Palech burst into tears. Jan Hus was found guilty of heresy on the 6th of July 1415 and handed over for ritual degradation. He was dressed in priestly robes as if for Holy Mass. Then the chalice was snatched from his hand, and one by one each of his garments was removed, while a curse was uttered at each stage. His hair was cut off, and a tall paper hat was placed on his head with 3 devils painted on it. Hus tried to calm himself by singing psalms as the guards led him out to the place of execution, next to the Rhine riverbank. On the way he saw Sigismund and called out to him, "Is this your safe passage?" Sigismund blushed with shame. He would be forever reviled in Bohemia for betraying his word of honour. Hus was bound to the stake by his wrists, and a rusty chain was tied around his neck. Wood and straw were laid around him up to his chin. When the fire was lit, Hus began to sing again, briefly, but his voice was stifled by the smoke, and then he died. He was 43 years old. His ashes were scooped up and dumped into the Rhine so that his followers could not venerate his remains. The news of Hus's execution detonated a firestorm of protest in Prague, and nothing would ever be the same. An angry letter of protest was sent to the Council of Constance, signed by 452 Czech nobles who pledged themselves to Hus's ideals. Priests loyal to Rome were steadily expelled from the nobles' estates and replaced with Utraquist clergymen willing to serve both bread and wine at Holy Communion. King Wenceslas, not wanting to poke a hornet's nest, looked the other way. On the morning of 30th of July, 1419, a radical priest named Jan Zalivsky delivered a fiery sermon at Our Lady of the Snows, taking his text from the apocalyptic Book of Revelation. From his pulpit, Zalivsky delivered the electrifying news that the end of human history was at hand, and that they, the righteous poor, would bear the awesome burden of living through the night of the Antichrist. Zalivsky identified the Emperor Sigismund, whom he called the Red Dragon, as the principal instigator of the end of days. Holding the Eucharist dramatically aloft in both hands, he led his congregation out of the church in a procession through the new town. The demonstrators, who had gathered their weapons, marched down to the new town hall to demand the release of some Hussite prisoners that were being held in the dungeon. The entry gate was shut. From a high window, the anti-Hussite councillors, appointed by Wenceslas, shouted down to the crowd. Someone inside threw a rock from the window, which ignited the mob's rage. They smashed down the portal and charged up the stairs, and there they found the enemy councillors. They picked them up and hurled them out the open window. Those who survived the fall were clubbed and stabbed to death as they lay in the street. This incident came to be known as the First Defenestration of Prague. Defenestration is taken from the Latin, and it means down from the window. It transformed the Bohemian reformists into revolutionaries. For 3 days, Hussite mobs rampaged through the churches and monasteries, helping themselves to the monks' reserves of food, wine and clothes. They attacked the houses of German Catholic merchants, driving many of them from the city for good. Brothels in the new town were invaded, the women expelled, and the buildings burnt down. Wenceslas had lost control of his capital. When told of the defenestration, he exploded in rage, then complained of pains in his hand and legs. He expired several days later from a stroke at the age of 58. The death of the childless Wenceslas IV cleared the way for his brother Sigismund to succeed him as King of Bohemia. But with most of the Czech nobility in revolt, it wasn't clear how Sigismund would be able to enter the city, let alone find a quorum of barons to formally elect him. In the meantime, Sigismund appointed his brother's widow, Queen Sophia, as regent of Bohemia. Fighting broke out between Hussite militias and the loyalist guards posted in the bridge towers. Artillery fire blasted down from the castle into the Hussite strongholds in Malá Strana, while the rebels advanced into the Archbishop's palace in Hradčany and ransacked it. The royalists fell back to the castle battlements, and Queen Sophia made a hasty departure from the city. On the 25th of October, a band of Hussite rebels, led by a one-eyed former mercenary named Jan Žižka, seized the fortress of Vyšehrad. After weeks of fighting, Malá Strana was a rubble-strewn ruin. With winter setting in, the warring parties agreed to an armistice, that would extend until the following spring. Sigismund's administrators at the castle agreed to tolerate Hussite worship so long as the rebels left the churches and monasteries alone. The rebels also agreed to hand back the fortress of Vyšehrad over the furious protests of Jan Žižka. Nothing which is mine or thine. The Hussites now split into two broad groups, a coalition of moderates from the old town of Prague and a loose group of radicals based in Prague's new town and the countryside. The moderate Utraquists were ready to accept Sigismund as king so long as he agreed to practice a live and let live policy towards Hussite forms of worship. But the radicals, full of revolutionary fervour, were ready to go much further. They wanted nothing less than to build a new Jerusalem in the countryside in preparation for the second coming of Christ. In the spring of 1420, the radicals took over an abandoned castle in southern Bohemia, near a hill they named Mount Tabor, after the biblical mountain where the disciples had witnessed the transfiguration of Christ, wreathed in light. At Tabor, in the bracing fresh air, the radicals established a revolutionary commune, an imitation of the early church, which they believed would light a beacon bright enough to be seen from heaven. Hussite preachers told their flock they could expect to see the final crisis of the earth erupt in the skies any day now. And where else would Christ choose to return if not right here at Tabor, among the elect? Heeding the urgent call to salvation, families came to Tabor from all over the Czech lands. The Taborites practiced a form of medieval communism that would be remembered centuries later when the Socialist Republic was established. "There is nothing which is mine or thine," they proclaimed. "Rather, all things in the community shall be held in common for all time." Social distinctions were cast aside as lords and servants laboured side by side and called each other brother and sister. Peasants, potters, priests, barbers, carpenters, town councillors, cobblers, blacksmiths and cooks laid down their possessions at the feet of Tabor's priests to be pooled and shared equally among the faithful. The cultish energy of the camp made all things seem possible. But the system fell into crisis when the funds in their community chest ran out. As members of the elect, the Taborites felt entitled to seize whatever they pleased from the enemies of God, which came to include anyone who was not a Taborite. The community rapidly evolved into a military camp, extorting dues from the local peasantry by force. Reports from Kutná Hora that German Catholics were hunting down Hussites and dropping them down mine shafts only accelerated the Taborites' journey from New Testament forgiveness to Old Testament violence. The first target of the Taborites' righteous violence was another millennial cult called the Adamites, who lived in the forests nearby and had adopted an even more primitive form of Christianity. The Adamites claimed they had regained the primeval innocence of the Garden of Eden and wandered through the towns and forests of Bohemia perfectly naked. They were a throwback to the legendary first Bohemian settlers who were said to have walked about naked in the sunshine and shared their possessions and lovers alike. It wasn't all free love. Like the Taborites, the Adamites came to see themselves as avenging angels of the Lord, who should wash their hands in the blood of their enemies. At night, groups of these naked terrorists launched attacks on neighbouring villages, massacring the inhabitants and seizing their goods. This was all too much for the Puritan Taborites, who sent a force of 400 soldiers to destroy the Adamite camp. Every one of the Adamites was killed or captured. The Taborite leader who led the attack on the Adamites was the one-eyed Jan Žižka, who had commanded the Hussite garrison at Vyšehrad. After the fortress was handed back to the royalists, Žižka had left Prague in disgust to offer his services to the Taborites. Jan Žižka was a military leader of genius, the most innovative European commander of his era. Forced to improvise with meagre resources, he invented a fluid new style of warfare that shocked and baffled his enemies for years. A former mercenary, Žižka had already lost an eye in battle and was slowly going blind in the other one. Nonetheless, his mind was able to envision the contours of a field of combat so vividly that he won victory after victory, often against much larger forces. Meanwhile, the Church had roused itself to deal with the uprising in Bohemia. The Council of Constance had repaired the schism in the papacy, deposing the three rival popes and replacing them with a single pontiff, Pope Martin V. In March 1420, Pope Martin called for a crusade against the Hussites. Emperor Sigismund summoned warriors from all over Christendom to join forces against the Bohemian heretics. The declaration of the crusade isolated Bohemia from the rest of Europe and intensified the defiant mood in Prague. At Tabor, Jan Žižka readied his people to fight. Farm tools were remade into weaponry. The flail, a threshing implement with a striking head attached to a pole or rope, was transformed into an effective combat weapon against a knight in armour. Wooden agricultural carts were made into primitive tanks, with slatted walls and hinged flaps. Some were designed to hold soldiers, others to hold lightweight gunpowder cannons. In most medieval societies, women were brought into combat only in the most desperate circumstances. At Tabor, they were trained to fight as frontline soldiers. A woman, as the Crusaders would soon discover, could wield a flail more or less as lethally as a man. In Prague, the Hussite authorities hurriedly prepared to defend their city. But when they received reports of the size of Sigismund's approaching armies, their defiance sank into defeatist gloom. An urgent plea for help was sent to the Taborites, and in May 1420, Jan Žižka rode out with his army to save the city of Prague. Žižka's army was welcomed into the city and offered every hospitality. But the Puritan Taborites were offended by the vanity of the townsfolk. They attacked wealthy burghers in the streets, using knives to cut off their foppish moustaches and to slash at the ornate garments of their wives until Žižka ordered them to desist. He put his troops under strict discipline, holding daily services with militant sermons. 1,500 Taborite women set to work digging a deep moat between the new town and Vyšehrad. Both moderate and radical Hussite barons rallied to sign a common manifesto known as the Four Articles of Prague, which declared that people should be free to preach the word of God, that the church should divest itself of all worldly property and secular power, that the Bohemian clergy should be punishable in secular courts for mortal sins, and that both kinds of communion should be granted to lay people. A set of 4 captains was elected for each town. Those families unwilling to accept the wine along with the bread were told to leave the city, while the remaining Catholic clergy and town councillors ran to Prague Castle and Vyšehrad for protection, hoping Sigismund's crusaders would arrive soon and return control of the city to them. Žižka's priority was to prevent a crusader blockade by keeping open a supply line on the eastern road to the city, so that Prague could, if necessary, sit tight behind their walls and wait out the crusaders. A steep elevation just outside the city known as Vítkov Hill suddenly became critically important. If it fell to the enemy, the eastern lifeline would be severed. Prague would be completely cut off and forced to choose between starvation and surrender. With time running out, a garrison of men and women were sent to build earth and stone fortifications at the summit of Vitkov Hill. As they hurried to complete their defences, they saw Sigismund's soldiers arriving and slowly spreading out on the far side of the river between Letna Plain and Holešovice. The enemy force, a coalition of Germans, Austrians, Silesians, Hungarians and Czech royalists, covered the whole plain with tents and encampments. Sigismund's troops gathered by the riverbank to taunt the Czech defenders, chanting, "Ha, ha, Hus, Hus, heretic, heretic." Vitkov Hill is a steep, narrow ridgeline shaped like a rocky shark's fin. On the 14th of July, Sigismund's crusaders crossed the river and made their way up the long arc of the hill. They captured a watchtower, then marched up to attack the earth and stone breastworks, thinly defended by a force of just 28 Taborite men and women armed with guns and flails, and a young girl who threw rocks at the invaders. Alerted to the danger, Žižka led his main force out from the city walls at a gallop. At the foot of Vitkov Hill, his soldiers began climbing the steep southern slope, their approach concealed by the foliage of the royal vineyards. On reaching the summit, the Hussites surprised the enemy and smashed into their left flank with their flails and pikes. And suddenly, the invaders realised how precariously exposed they were. Attacked by the Hussites to the front and to the side, they were simultaneously being pushed up the hill from behind by the rest of the Crusaders. There was nowhere for the invaders to move on the narrow ridge. Several knights shifted over and then tumbled down the side. Men and horses toppled down the rocky slope, crashing into their fellow soldiers, breaking arms, legs and necks. The fight was over in an hour. Despite their overwhelming numerical superiority, the Crusaders retreated, leaving nearly 300 of their men broken or dead on the hillside. Within the city, those who had been bracing themselves for disaster gave thanks to God for their deliverance. The astonishing, unlikely triumph was proof enough to the Hussites that they had become an instrument of divine will. No longer wretched peasants, they were God's warriors, marching towards certain victory. The triumph also burnished a growing national pride among the Czechs. Somehow, this small nation had tapped into deep reserves of ingenuity and courage and moral rectitude to defeat the forces of a degenerate empire. The proud boast of Czech exceptionalism, personified by their one-eyed hero Jan Žižka, would be both a psychological balm and a torment for centuries to come. While the Hussites rejoiced, Sigismund reeled in disbelief. The losses at Vitkov Hill only amounted to a small fraction of his army, but Crusader morale was sunk. Sigismund dropped his plans for a triumphant coronation at Prague Castle. Instead, he had to be smuggled into the castle on the 27th of July 1420 by a group of loyalist barons who crowned him King of Bohemia and then had to smuggle him out again. Meanwhile, Sigismund's mercenaries roamed through the woods outside the city walls, murdering Czech civilians and dumping their bodies on a heap within their camp. The grim satisfaction they gleaned from these atrocities was offset by the stench of the corpses in the summer heat. The unsanitary conditions led to infestations of flies and then a demoralising outbreak of disease in the Crusader camps. Sigismund had been counting on paying his troops with loot from the conquered city. And so when his money ran out, the coalition partners broke camp and trudged home. The First Crusade against the Hussites had ended in complete failure. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the tensions between the rustic Taborites and the urban Utraquists of Prague flared up again. The moderate Hussites of Prague still dared to hope for reform and eventual reconciliation with Rome, but the radicals in the city and the Taborites wanted a complete break. They demanded that all church properties in Prague be nationalised, and that all remaining taverns and brothels be closed. Immodest clothing was to be prohibited. Sins such as fornication, adultery, swearing, and consumption of alcohol were to be punished in public. Groups of fanatical Taborites burnt several churches in the new town, but when they attempted to do the same in the old town, they were warned off by members of the Butchers' Guild, who lined up against them with knives and axes. On the 10th of August, a party of Taborites marched out of the city walls to the Cistercian monastery of Zabraslav, which held the great tombs of the Przemyslid and Luxembourg kings. When they discovered the monastery's wine cellar, all Puritan discipline was abandoned, and the Taborites drank themselves into a stupor while they ransacked the tombs. The body of Wenceslas IV, only recently laid to rest, was pulled out of its sarcophagus and placed on an altar with a straw crown. The drunken Taborites then poured wine on his rotting head, joking, "If you'd been alive, you'd be drinking with us anyway." They returned to Prague later in the day, still drunk, wearing priests' tussocks, parading through the streets with broken paintings and altarpieces. In September, the rebels put the royalist garrison at Vyšehrad to siege. Hearing of this, Sigismund vowed he would shit in the faces of the enemy rather than surrender the fortress. But as always, Sigismund was too slow. By the time his army showed up, the captain of the garrison had already surrendered. Many of the guard went over to the Hussites. Sigismund's army was then beaten decisively in the village, which is now the suburb, of Pankratz, and more Czech nobles came over to the Hussite cause. In May 1421, the half-starved royalist garrison at Prague Castle gave up hope of being relieved by Sigismund, and they signed an armistice as well. The seat of Bohemia's kings was now in the hands of the rebels. Pope Martin V, unfazed by the collapse of the First Crusade, called for a second holy war against the Hussites. In late 1421, Sigismund's army re-entered Bohemia and pinned Žižka's army against the outer walls of Kutná Hora. Žižka escaped by waiting until the middle of the night, then reconfiguring his war wagons into a flying column that punched a hole through Sigismund's lines, scattering his troops with lethal gunfire. Žižka, who was by now totally blind, had been unfazed by the difficulties of fighting in the dark. His feat of improvisation had saved the Taborite army, and along the way he had accidentally invented the world's first mobile artillery unit. After Žižka's daring escape, the Crusaders at Kutná Hora relaxed their guard, and they went into winter quarters. But Žižka's blood was up. On the 6th of January 1422, he wheeled his army around and attacked a regiment of Sigismund's men quartered to the north of Kutná Hora, catching them completely off guard. Sigismund and his remaining forces dropped everything and fled towards the border. At the town of Nemecký Brod, Sigismund ordered his troops to give him cover to escape into Hungary. But Jan Žižka was now a feared, almost mythical figure, and so when the Crusaders heard the Hussites' battle trumpets, they panicked and ran again in disarray. The fleeing Crusaders pulled up in confusion at the Sazava River, which had frozen over in the winter cold. Rather than risk their horses on the rickety bridge, the knights elected to ride over the river's icy crust. But when the heavy cavalry gingerly stepped onto the frozen surface, the ice gave way. Soon the river was full of freezing, drowning knights, dragged down by their armour. The Second Crusade had collapsed even more ignominiously than the first. Bohemia was now completely in the hands of the Hussites. Žižka's drum. In Rome, questions were asked about Sigismund's competence. A third anti-Hussite crusade was launched, and it too was repelled by the Hussites. But once again, as the external threat to Bohemia receded, tensions between the radical and moderate Hussites resurfaced. Control of Prague had shifted decisively to the moderate Utraquists, who had become weary of the fanatical Taborites and longed for reconciliation with Rome and Europe. In the brief civil war that broke out between the Hussites, Jan Žižka won battles against the Utraquist forces as decisively as he had against the Crusaders. The two factions signed a treaty of peace on the 13th of September 1424. And 1 month later, Jan Žižka was dead, a victim of the plague. As he lay dying, so the legend goes, Žižka was asked how he wanted to be buried. The general asked that his body be flayed, that a drum be fashioned from his skin, and with this drum they should go to war. His enemies, he said, would turn and run as soon as they heard its sound. Jan Žižka died having won every single battle that he'd led. Thereafter, his soldiers called themselves orphans, as though they had lost a father. Today, Žižka's military genius is commemorated in Prague by a massive equestrian statue at the top of Vítkov Hill in Žižkov, the suburb of Prague that bears his name. Compactata. The death of Žižka encouraged the Pope to call a fourth crusade against the Hussites. Žižka's successor as Taborite commander, Prokop the Bald, proved to be another gifted military leader, and he dealt out yet more defeats to the Crusaders. All of Europe, it seemed, was ranged against the Czech Hussites, but no one had been found who could defeat them. In France, an angry Joan of Arc fired off a threatening letter to the Bohemian rebels. "To tell you frankly," she wrote, "if I don't find out that you have reformed yourselves, I might leave the English behind and go against you, and relieve you of either your heresy or your life." In August 1431, a fifth and final crusade was launched. A crusader army entered Bohemia, and yet again the invaders were utterly routed. War weariness had now set in on both sides, and in October 1431 the Hussites were invited to a church council at Basel to seek a reconciliation. The revolutionary energy of the Hussites was dissipating. The apocalyptic predictions made so confidently at the outset of the rebellion had not come to pass. The world was still there, and they would all have to find a way to live in it. The radical Taborites, however, wanted no reconciliation. In a bid to undermine peace negotiations, Prokop the Bald's army besieged Pilsen, which was then in Catholic hands. The attack split the Hussites irrevocably. The Czech nobles, both Catholic and Utraquist, closed ranks against the radicals and formed a new military league to keep the peace. In 1434, they defeated the Taborites at Lipany. Prokop the Bald was killed in the fighting, and his army was destroyed. The Battle of Lipani brought the Hussite Wars to a close. With the radicals defeated, the Utraquists were able to arrive at a compromise with the Church, the Compactata of Prague, which was couched in a vague, watered-down form of words that the two sides could live with. The Utraquist form of worship was to be grudgingly tolerated, but only in Bohemia and Moravia. The Compactata opened the way for Sigismund to be accepted at long last as the legitimate king of Bohemia. In August 1436, he declared the war between Christendom and Bohemia to be over, and he entered Prague unopposed. Sigismund, who was now nearly 70, had learnt nothing and forgotten nothing. Once on the throne, he indulged in an act of petty vengeance, ordering the last of the Bohemian radicals to be tortured and then publicly hanged. People openly wept over the dead and spoke of them as martyrs, and Sigismund was hated more than ever. Sigismund suffered from painful gout, just as his father Charles IV had. The day after the executions, one of his feet was suddenly afflicted with fiery pain. His big toe had to be amputated, and then, in stages, the rest of the leg. Praguers concluded the corruption of his soul was eating away at him bodily. On the 11th of November 1437, the miserable, pain-racked king was carried out of Prague on a stretcher to escape the angry mob. He was hoping to reach safety in Hungary, but got as far as Moravia, where Sigismund, the last of the Luxembourg kings of Bohemia, died on the 9th of December. Orloi. Prague emerged from the Hussite Wars battered and pockmarked. Artillery fire had levelled whole precincts of the city. Puritan zeal had obliterated countless books and manuscripts and paintings and sculptures. The unity of the Church was not restored. The Utraquists governed themselves at a cool distance from the Church in Rome, while the remaining Taborites and radicals eventually coalesced into an entirely separate group called the Czech Brethren, who elected laymen and preachers to lead them. The Czech Brethren stressed the primacy of Scripture and preached the gospel of radical equality before God. Unlike the Taborites, they condemned all forms of violence. And yet, it was during the turbulent 15th century that Prague's Old Town Square was endowed with its loveliest jewel, the astronomical clock, a masterpiece of art and engineering that moment by moment describes the city's position in time and space. The legend of how the clock came to be is still retold today. In those years before the wars of religion, the proud and wealthy burghers of Prague's Old Town invited a clockmaker named Master Hanush to the city. Their instructions were simple. "Make us a clock for the tower of our town hall," they said, "a clock that has no equal anywhere in the world." Master Hanush laboured for years, his work concealed by sheets of cloth and timber scaffolding. When the cloth was pulled down, the people of Prague gasped in wonder. The clock was a marvel, a whirling ensemble of golden hoops, numerals, symbols, stars and planets. Its upper dial was ringed with golden numerals to indicate Prague time, Old Czech time, and even ancient Babylonian time. In the centre, a disc representing the Earth was fixed onto a background of dusky blue and twilight orange. A smaller zodiac ring displayed the paths of the sun and the moon. Below the clock face was a second dial, a calendar, with a circle of painted medallions representing the 12 months. Master Hanush invited the dazzled town councillors inside the tower to inspect the clock's engine room. They gaped at the intricate apparatus of interlocking gears rotated by screw threads attached to weights of various sizes. The new wonder clock filled the people of Prague with pride. The councillors agreed that Master Hanush had indeed given them the most beautiful clock in the world. They paid him handsomely and invited him to a banquet in his honour at the town hall. That night, Master Hanush was hailed with toast after toast. He drank so much wine, he began to feel drowsy. "Don't worry," said the mayor. "We've made a bed for you in the room above the clock." Hours later, the drowsy clockmaker was awakened by a noise. In the darkness, he saw a glowing ember floating towards him. As it came closer, he saw it was a piece of hot iron carried on tongs by the town executioner, who plunged it into both his eyes. His task accomplished, the executioner knelt on one knee and begged Master Hanush's forgiveness. "It was the only way," he pleaded. "We had to be certain. You could not make a better clock elsewhere." Master Hanush lay in that room for week after week, pondering his revenge. True, he was blind, but he knew every inch of the tower by touch. And so one night, he rose from his bed, felt his way into the clock's engine room, and threw his body into the iron gears, which ground him up and killed him. The clock was frozen at the moment of Master Hanush's death. Not one person in Prague had the skill to repair it. Visitors to Prague dwindled away. No one was interested in seeing a stopped clock. 100 years passed before the mechanism could be made to run again, and by then all the councillors were dead. The folk tale of Master Hanush is recounted daily to groups of tourists who gather at the astronomical clock to watch it chime the hour. But there's no truth to the legend. There was a Master Hanush, but he worked on the clock only after its inception. Its true creator was Mikuláš of Kadaň, who devised it in 1410 with the aid of an astronomer from the university. Neither man was blinded by the authorities. The calendar dial of the clock was added in 1490, as were the 4 automated figures that flank the clock on either side. On the left is vanity, symbolised by an effeminate man with a mirror. He stands next to greed, represented by a Jew with a money bag. The statue was altered after the Second World War to make it appear not quite so blatantly anti-Semitic. On the right of the dial is the dreaded Muslim Turk, who turns his back on the 4th and most prominent figure, Death, the skeleton. Every hour, Death's bony arm jerks up and down, ringing the bell, reminding us of our mortality, while the narcissist, the moneylender, and the infidel shake their heads foolishly in denial. The clock's most popular feature, the Parade of the 12 Apostles, was installed in the 18th century. Every hour between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m, 2 wooden doors slide open above the dial and a procession of automated wooden statues trundles past, each figure turning momentarily towards the crowd before moving along. St. Peter carries a golden key, while St. Paul clutches a book and a sword. The clock, known in Czech as the orloj, has been stopped several times over the centuries for repairs or restoration. Each time, superstitious Praguers cringe, thanks to another folk legend that attached itself to the clock after the mass execution of 27 Czech rebels in the Old Town Square in 1621. Every year, on the anniversary of their deaths, the ghosts of the Czech martyrs are said to wander up to the astronomical clock to see if its hands are still turning, and if not, A season of horror and bloodshed will be let loose on the city. The White Lady. The Hussite Wars had left Prague an almost entirely Czech city. The Germans, who had sided with the Church, had been forced out, and the Czech language moved from the background to the foreground of public life and was established as the language of religion, education, and administration. In 1458, the Bohemian nobility elected one of their own, George of Poděbrady, as their king. George had impeccable Hussite credentials. His father had fought in the Battle of Vítkov Hill, and Jan Žižka himself had stood at George's christening as his godfather. George's rival for the throne was a man named Oldřich II, the Catholic patriarch of the powerful Rosenberg clan, which had dominated southern Bohemia for centuries. The Rosenbergs' vast landholdings included 22 castles, 6 towns, and close to 500 villages and hamlets. As a young man, Oldřich had been a Hussite sympathiser, but when war broke out, he joined the royalist Catholic cause. Oldřich had hoped to be elected king by the Bohemian estates, but George of Poděbrady outfoxed him by cutting a deal with Oldřich's eldest son, Jan, to waive a major family debt in return for his support. Oldřich could only seethe helplessly as his son Jan rode alongside the new king on his coronation procession through the streets of Prague. Liberated from the crushing debt, Jan was now free to resolve a scandal that had weighed on the Rosenbergs family's conscience for years: the plight of his sister, Perchta. Perchta of Rosenberg had been married off at a young age to a powerful Moravian landholder, John of Liechtenstein, but the union was based on a terrible misunderstanding. Oldřich believed his future son-in-law was wealthy enough not to require full payment of the bridal dowry. John of Liechtenstein, however, had spent freely on banquets and tournaments, and he was relying on Perchta's dowry to clear his debts. When the money was not forthcoming, he beat Perchta, refused to spend any money on her, and forced her to sell her jewellery. Perchta sent plaintive letters to her father. "When you gave me in marriage," she wrote, "it would have been better had you buried me in the ground." Oldřich, however, was unwilling to encroach on a fundamental tenet of male-dominated society, the rule of a husband over his wife. All he could do was write back, lamely asking his daughter to be of good cheer. Perchta's miserable situation became a scandal among the nobility, until her brother's deal with King George made full payment of the dowry possible. After her husband's death, Perchta returned to the family estate at Český Krumlov. She lived long enough to see every one of her children die from various causes before she succumbed to the plague in 1476. Thereafter, the castle servants reported seeing a pale female apparition in the chambers and corridors, wearing a simple white dress with keys bound to her sash. Naturally, the ghostly figure was believed to be the restless spirit of Perchta, who had been cursed by her husband on his deathbed when she refused to forgive his cruelty. The White Lady made repeated visits to the family nursery at Český Krumlov. One night in 1539, the nurse caring for the infant Peter Vogt Rosenberg fell asleep in her chair. When she awoke, she saw the White Lady looking over the baby's crib. In her terror, she shouted at the apparition to leave, and the White Lady obediently passed through the wall and was never seen again. The tale of Perchta's ghost is just one of many white lady stories told all over the world. The legends are nearly always attached to the tale of a woman who was badly wronged in life. In Mexico, La Llorona weeps as she goes about looking for children to drown. In Guatemala, La Ciguanaba lures unfaithful men to a cliff's edge, where they fall to their deaths in fright. In Ireland, the White Lady of Kinsale is known to push soldiers downstairs in revenge for the death of her husband. In Japan, ghostly Yurei, clad in white burial kimonos, are seen walking through Japanese villages at night. Kuchisaki Onna, a beautiful woman whose face was slashed from ear to ear by her samurai husband, wanders the streets, asking villagers, "Am I pretty?" Evolutionary psychologists refer to these apparitions as sensed presences, which tend to appear in isolated or stressful environments. Coldness also seems to be a factor, but the broad cross-cultural similarities of these women in white suggests some kind of universal archetype, a projection that answers to a universal human need or fear. Perhaps Perchta and her weird sisters are some kind of psychotic manifestation of guilt for the mistreatment of women. The Bohemians have another folk tale of a malevolent woman in white, the Polodnitsa, or noonday witch, who can be spied in the hot summer months, gliding eerily through the tall fields of wheat in a billowing white dress, looking for children. In the 19th century, Karel Jaromir Urban, a young scholar at Prague's National Museum, travelled around Bohemia, gathering up old Bohemian folk tales and reworking them into fabulously macabre poems. His book, A Bouquet, was an instant classic, read by adults and children ever since. In Urban's poem, Noonday Witch, an overworked mother becomes so exasperated by her little boy's temper tantrum that she cries out for the witch to take him. "Come for him, you noonday witch, then. Come and take this pest for me." In the door into the kitchen, someone softly turns the key. And suddenly the noonday witch is there, advancing towards her in the airless room. The terrified mother clenches her little boy ever more tightly as the witch slowly extends her hand. Then the clock strikes midday, the woman's husband strides in from the fields for his lunch and sees that his wife has squeezed their son to death. Ich bin ein Hussite. George of Podjebrady succeeded in stabilising Bohemia, but his bid for reconciliation with Rome was a lost cause. Pope Pius II scorned all of King George's diplomatic overtures, demanding that he renounce the Utraquist heresy and enforce strict Catholic orthodoxy in his kingdom. When King George refused, he was excommunicated. To George's mind, this was a poor time for the Pope to be picking a fight with his fellow Christians. Europe was still reeling from the conquest of Constantinople by the Muslim Ottoman Turks in 1453, and now Mehmet the Conqueror's fearsome Janissaries were marching further into Eastern Europe. To contain the common threat to Christendom, George tried to work around the intransigent Pope. He wrote to the various Christian kings and princes of Europe with a radical proposition: a league of princes that would bring together the major European powers to coordinate a common military response to the Turkish threat. Differences between the powers, he suggested, could be settled peacefully by a pan-European assembly that would move between the major cities every 5 years. The courts of Europe mulled over George's proposal and then rejected it, for fear of antagonising the Pope. But his idea is today widely recognised as the first iteration of an idea that would come to fruition 5 centuries later as the modern European Union. King George was to be the very last Czech to wear the crown of St. Wenceslas. After his death in 1471, the Bohemian estates offered the crown to the eldest son of the King of Poland. The Polish Jagiellonian kings, preoccupied by battles elsewhere, were absentee monarchs, and for 5 decades the country was effectively run by the Czech nobility. The powers of the royal central government were worn down to a nub. Ludwig, the last Jagiellonian king of Bohemia, died in 1526, falling off his horse in a battle against the Ottoman Empire. With the throne vacant and no obvious successor in sight, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria put himself forward as a candidate. The 24-year-old Ferdinand was a Habsburg and the younger brother of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Ferdinand was militantly Catholic, but he readily agreed to confirm the privileges and religious liberties of the Utraquists and to move his court to Prague Castle. Ferdinand's election as King of Bohemia was to have momentous, unforeseen consequences. The nobles expected their new ruler would be heavily preoccupied defending Austria and Hungary against the Ottoman Turks, leaving control of Bohemia in their hands. Ferdinand, however, was an unusually adroit politician, and his tenure saw a sharp shift of power from the estates back to the monarchy. Ferdinand's reign began just as the Protestant Reformation was underway in Germany and Switzerland. The German Lutherans discovered they had natural affinities with the Czech Hussites. At Leipzig, in the debate which preceded his excommunication, Martin Luther himself had happily declared, "Ja, ich bin ein Hussite." The Utraquist doctrine of dispensing both the bread and the wine to congregations was adopted by nearly all the Reformed churches, and with that, the Czech Utraquists, the pariahs of Catholic Europe, were no longer isolated. The Protestant revolt plugged them into a dynamic continental movement. The evangelical New Utraquists moved towards the Lutherans, while the conservative Old Utraquists slowly drifted back towards the safety of the Catholic Church. The Czech Brethren naturally gravitated towards the more puritanical Swiss Calvinists. The Belvedere. King Ferdinand was careful not to tread on the prerogatives of the Bohemian nobles so long as he needed their financial support in the war against the Turks. It was only in 1545, after a truce was concluded with the Sultan, that Ferdinand felt strong enough to sharply curtail their power. When he requested that they supply him with troops to support his campaign against the Protestant German princes, the Bohemians balked and raised a small army to assist their co-religionists. Ferdinand easily defeated the German rebels without their help, and the feeble revolt of the Czech Utraquists collapsed. On his return to Prague, Ferdinand ordered the public execution of 4 rebel barons. He placed the town councils under the firm control of the castle, and, in a decision that would have enormous consequences down the track, the power of the Bohemian estates to elect their king was revoked, leaving them only the right to confirm the Habsburg candidate presented to them. Bohemia was to be slowly absorbed into the Habsburgs' Austrian Empire. Having boxed in the Bohemian estates, Ferdinand was ready to reassert Catholic power in Prague. The church had changed since Jan Hus's time. It had rid itself of its more corrupt elements and recovered much of its confidence. Ferdinand invited the Jesuits to Prague and gave them the use of a Dominican monastery in the Old Town, the Clementium, where they established a college to compete with the Utrecht-dominated university. The Clementium attracted the sons of the Catholic nobles and wealthy burghers, giving Ferdinand a reliable pool of talent for his administration. The Jesuits established a dazzling library at the Clementium, which claims, with some justification, to be the most beautiful in the world, with its twisting Baroque columns, ornately carved shelves, and a luminous ceiling fresco. In his short story, The Secret Miracle, the Argentinian novelist Jorge Luis Borges imagined that God himself was hiding in the Clementium library inside a single letter printed in one of its thousands of volumes. Ferdinand was a cold-blooded political operator, but he had a sentimental side. He was deeply devoted to his wife Anne, and in 1531 he conceived of creating a pleasure palace for her in the new Italian style on the northern bank of the castle's Stag Moat, which would be crossed by a covered wooden bridge. The summer palace, known as the Belvedere, was a spacious and light-filled Renaissance palazzo, surrounded with an airy open arcade and decorated with dozens of classical murals, including an image of Ferdinand presenting Queen Anne with a flower. Along the ridge, Ferdinand established orchards of aromatic trees bearing figs, almonds, apricots, oranges, and lemons. The airy palace looked like nothing else in Prague. On a warm summer afternoon, it must have seemed like a floating dream compared to the stony Gothic castle across the moat. The summer palace was completed in 1564, but Queen Anne had long since died after giving birth to her 15th child. Today, the pleasure palace created for her is regarded as the loveliest example of Renaissance architecture north of the Alps. During the Hussite Rebellion, artists, architects and craftsmen had avoided revolutionary Prague rather than risk having their work destroyed by riots, cannon fire, or Puritan vandalism. That was all set to change. With the Belvedere, Prague had glimpsed the first rays of a new dawn of art, science, and magic, which was to be presided over by the strangest human being ever to dwell in Prague Castle. Chapter 4. The Great Work. June 1600. 1,000 excited spectators gathered in the open-air courtyard of Receck College. The crowd, an assortment of medical students, dignitaries, and fashionable Praguers, looked on as the freshly hanged corpse of a man was carried into the courtyard and brought to the waiting figure of Dr. Jan Jasenius. The doctor produced a scalpel and then slid it across the lower trunk of the dead man's body, carefully exposing the subcutaneous layer of flesh and then the abdominal muscles. The public autopsy unfolded over 5 days as Jasenius methodically dissected the inner workings of the hanged man's body, exposing the intestines and stomach, then the kidneys, liver, and gallbladder, the reproductive organs, the chest, lungs, and heart, and finally, the skull, brain, eyes, and ears. The surgeon was thankful, he said, for the unusually cool summer weather, which allowed him to proceed without being overly bothered by the stench. Dr. Jan Jasenius, born in Breslau, educated at 3 universities, was a surgeon and anatomist with a lively and wide-ranging intellect. By his mid-30s, he had already written several treatises on philosophy, politics, and medicine, such as On the Immortality of the Human Soul and For the Defence Against Tyrants and on the place of putrefying bile in acquired malaria. Dr. Jan Jasenius came to Prague at the invitation of the famous astronomer Tycho Brahe, who had just accepted the position of the Emperor's imperial mathematician. Dr. Jasenius was enchanted by Prague and was moved to praise it as, quote, probably the richest city worldwide. His public autopsy created a sensation, and his published notes from the dissection, sprinkled with fables and quotes from the Bible, earned gushing praise from fellow physicians. "On this way you will stay on the summit," wrote one of them. "Your name will flare into the coming eras." Prague, at the end of the 16th century, had entered a golden age of art and science. The ideals of the Renaissance, the pursuit of knowledge, a rejection of dogma, a rediscovery of the genius of the classical world, had spread north from Italy slowly and haltingly, but the new spirit transformed the Bohemian capital into a cosmopolitan city of 60,000 souls, the largest in Central Europe. Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor and grandson of Ferdinand I, had shifted his court from Vienna to Prague, reviving the city's status as a political and cultural centre. Elegant new palaces, built by Italian architects and stonemasons, took their place on Prague's dramatic skyline. The Italian artisans were soon followed by astronomers, artists, inventors, and alchemists, who came to Prague intent on the discovery of new knowledge, or the recovery of secrets they believed had been lost to the world since ancient times. Just as Dr. Jasenius used his scalpel to reveal the organic machinery under the skin of the human animal, others deployed mathematics, observations of the natural world, and magic rites to uncover the secret workings of the cosmos. Many of these Renaissance scholars shared an underlying assumption that everything in the world had a secret unity. They believed there was a hidden network of correspondences between all things, created by God, who endowed humans with perception and reason so we might figure it out. Most people perceived the cosmos the same way a cat might observe a Shakespeare play, noticing all the shouting and the movement without comprehending the larger, coherent narrative. It required exceptional minds to investigate the clues that God had left littered around the earth to understand his workings. The central figure of this glittering era was the strange, reclusive emperor in the castle on the hill. Rudolf II, in his portraits, looks at us impassively, with large, round eyes framed by quizzical, gingery eyebrows. His sensitive mouth, set in his bulging Habsburg jaw, neither smiles nor grimaces. His demeanour betrays nothing of his state of mind. Rudolf would rather observe than be observed. Foreign visitors to the imperial court in Prague were fascinated by the inscrutable emperor. The English diplomat Sir Philip Sidney sketched him as few of words, sullen of disposition, very secret and resolute, extremely spanulated. Spanulated meant overly stiff and formal, steeped in the customs of the gloomy court in Madrid, where Rudolf had received his education. But the emperor's neutral expression was carefully cultivated. He was a man caught between his responsibilities, his secret obsessions, and his painfully introverted nature. As emperor, Rudolf was invested with great power and dignity. But the exercise of those powers was constrained by the hardening divisions within his realm, particularly in Bohemia. friendly relations between families withered, as both Protestants and Catholics found common cause with their co-religionists beyond the kingdom's borders. Protestant noblemen travelled to universities in Wittenberg and Geneva, where the flame of the Reformation still burnt brightly, while Catholic nobles urged the Vatican to set up forward bases in Prague for a reconquista of the souls of the wayward Bohemians. Their efforts were fervently supported by the increasingly militant Habsburgs, who now dominated Central Europe from their German branch in Vienna, while the Spanish branch of the family ruled from Madrid. The Bohemians, overwhelmingly Protestant, remained stubbornly resistant to re-Catholicisation. But they were still divided between the establishment Utrechists, who behaved as a kind of church in exile within the Catholic mainstream, and the radical anti-clerical Czech Brethren. Each group deemed the other too unreasonable or too ungodly. Rudolf, bored and irritated by all this Christian infighting, strove to keep a lofty distance above it all. He resented Catholic pressure from his family and the papal nuncio and the Jesuits, just as much as he disdained the Protestants squabbling over petty points of dogma. His refusal to come down hard on one side or the other kept the peace for a long time, but it won him few friends. Beleaguered by the entrenched religious hatreds and wearied by the bureaucratic grind, the Emperor Rudolf retreated into the inner world of his private obsessions. Within the walls of his enormous palace at Hradčany, Rudolf became a hoarder on a stupendous scale, surrounding himself with beautiful, weird, and wondrous things. Wildly erotic paintings, intricately engraved gems, clockwork robotic devices, and esoteric books. He installed these fantastic treasures in his own private Kunstkammer, a chamber of curiosities within Prague Castle, where he would lose himself for hours, alone. Rudolf's Kunstkammer became famous throughout Europe, but was seen by only a few visitors. Carlo Manfredi, ambassador for the Duke of Savoy, arrived at Hradčany in late 1604, and he spent 9 frustrating months waiting around for the emperor to grant him an audience. When Rudolf finally consented to receive him, Manfredi solemnly presented him with an Indian dagger, a rhino horn studded with rubies, a large silver model of a ship containing half an Indian coconut and a crown, and 3 bezoars, hard stones that grow in the stomachs of animals made from compacted hair and indigestible material that were thought to neutralise poison. Rudolf was delighted with these exotic gifts, and he shyly invited Manfredi to take a tour of the Kunstkammer. The ambassador passed from room to room in amazement, gazing at the numbered cabinets, cases and chests. Mounted on the walls, he saw a stuffed loris, a sloth, and a red-billed toucan. In the middle of one room stood a long green table laden with mechanical devices, a clock with an astrolabe and rotating planets, a robotic metal peacock that could walk and fan its feathers, and a small harpsichord made of glass. Manfredi was most impressed, however, by a large bowl carved from a single chunk of agate, whose natural veining spelt out the word Christ. Outside the stillness of the Kunstkammer, Rudolf kept a menagerie of living wonders within the castle grounds. Birds of paradise, crocodiles, a cassowary from New Guinea, a dodo from Mauritius, and a special enclosure full of big cats, lions, tigers, and leopards. Exotic creatures from distant climates were unlikely to last long at Prague Castle, but such concerns failed to move the compulsive collector in the castle. What he knows, wrote one aristocrat, he feels obliged to have. Rudolf was particularly fond of one lion named Muhammad that was given to him by the Turkish Sultan in one of the brief interludes of peace between them. Rudolf treated Muhammad like a domestic pet and allowed him to prowl the castle grounds and corridors. Muhammad would sometimes curl up and sleep at the emperor's feet, which would have been a fine way to keep court business brisk and to the point. But Rudolf often lacked the funds to feed the big cats properly. Court records show several compensation payments made to various servants who had been mauled, some of them fatally. Of all these wonders, natural and artificial, the treasures most precious to Rudolf were a 6-foot-long unicorn horn that was most likely from a narwhal, and a jewelled chalice from Constantinople, which he believed to be the Holy Grail, the cup that caught the blood of Christ as it spilled from the cross. In moments of anxiety, Rudolf would sometimes perform a rite of protection with these two magical objects, drawing a circle with the tip of his sword and then retreating into the circle with the Grail and the long horn to pray and meditate.
This is the end of CD 4. The book continues on CD 5. CD 5.
Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Hungary, Croatia and Bohemia, Archduke of Austria, was born in Vienna in 1552. His parents, Maximilian of Austria and Maria of Spain, were first cousins who had 16 children together, 6 of whom died before reaching their second birthday. Rudolf emerged from his mother's womb sickly and small. To sustain his feeble heartbeat, the newborn was inserted into the warm carcass of a freshly killed lamb. Having survived this ordeal, he became the oldest living male issue of Maximilian and Maria. Hoping for great things, they had the French seer Nostradamus cast a horoscope for their infant son. The astrologer predicted that Rudolf would attain a great exaltation of reign and empire. At the age of 11, Rudolf and his younger brother Ernest were packed off to Madrid to be placed in the care of his uncle, King Philip II of Spain, a black-clad militant Catholic who personally supervised their religious education. Philip insisted the boys accompany him to an auto da fe in Toledo, where Rudolf witnessed the burning of a band of Lutheran heretics at the stake. Philip relished this kind of ghastly spectacle, but it surely must have traumatised the brothers. Like so many of Philip's ventures, the lesson proved counterproductive. Rudolf recoiled from his uncle's fanaticism, and as a ruler, he showed no interest in persecuting the Protestants and Jews of his realm. If Philip had failed to make a religious zealot of his sensitive nephew, he did succeed in kindling a fascination for the weirder realms of art and science. While wandering the vast and gloomy corridors of Philip's palace, the teenaged Rudolf was exposed to his uncle's collection of alchemical and astronomical books and paraphernalia, as well as Hieronymus Bosch's feverish triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delights, with its dream-like landscapes of heaven and hell. When Rudolf turned 19, he was at last permitted to return to his parents in Vienna. His father, who was a warm-hearted man, was delighted to welcome his sons home, but he was dismayed by their spanielated manners, ingrained by their uncle Philip. Maximilian was now Holy Roman Emperor, and Rudolf heir apparent. His father prepared him for the imperial throne by awarding him the various crowns and titles of the Habsburg realms. And in 1575, Rudolf was brought to Prague to be crowned King of Bohemia and King of the Romans. The Italian portraitist Giuseppe Arcimboldo sketched Rudolf at his coronation, but his bejewelled crown looks too large for his head and seems to weigh down on him. Emperor Maximilian died a year later, and Rudolf duly succeeded him as Holy Roman Emperor. He was 24 years old. His family and their Jesuit confessors watched him closely to see if he would turn out to be a steadfast ally of the Church or a backslider like his father, who had become so worn down by Catholic dogmatism he had refused the last rites on his deathbed. The Rudolphine era was ill-starred from its inception. In 1577, within the first year of Rudolph's reign, a comet streaked across the skies of Europe. Court astrologers linked it to Saturn and Mars, a disastrous combination, and a sign of God's displeasure with the mortal realm and perhaps its new ruler. Rudolf was intelligent, curious, and tolerant, but in all other respects, he was tragically unsuited for the role of emperor. He lacked resolve and was a poor judge of character. He was too shy to impress his will upon people and succumbed to long bouts of mental illness. Problems were left to fester in the hope that someone else might sort them out. When he did rouse himself into action, it was often too late and the matter would blow up in his face, making him appear even more hapless. In Vienna, where he began his reign, Rudolf soon became morose and indifferent to his responsibilities. His mother tried to arrange a marriage with Philip's daughter Isabel, which would have been yet another marriage of first cousins. But Rudolf dragged his feet and nothing came of it. Rudolf would go on to father several children with his favourite mistress, but all were born out of wedlock and ineligible to succeed him. At first, the young emperor tried to participate in the rounds of balls and court dinners in Vienna, but he soon became ill and severely depressed. He remained in his bed for months. Courtiers began to wonder if Rudolf had inherited the same strain of Habsburg madness that had afflicted his great-grandmother Joanna the Mad, who had refused to allow her husband's body to be buried, in case he should be resurrected from the dead. The months of illness and inactivity passed into years, until 1580, when Rudolf recovered enough strength to undertake several trips to Prague, which offered him a degree of peace and isolation compared to the busy, noisy court in Vienna. On the castle grounds, Rudolf supervised the construction of handsome new Renaissance palaces that lifted some of the stony Gothic gloom from the precinct, and Rudolf's spirits rose along with them. In 1583, Rudolf took the bold step of moving the imperial seat from Vienna to Prague, shifting the Holy Roman Empire's centre of gravity. The move was justified by military considerations as much as personal preference. Vienna was too close to the frontier with the Ottoman Turks. Prague, located 200 miles to the northwest, was safer and more defensible. Perched high on the bluff at Hradčany, the castle was close to the city and yet detached from it. Here Rudolf hoped he could hold his meddlesome family at bay, live on his own terms, and follow his own star. Prague, at the time of Rudolf's coronation, was still a conglomeration of 5 contiguous towns, each ringed with walls and gates, a mix of grand stone houses, Gothic churches, and medieval slums. In 1591, a young English traveller named Fynes Moryson came to the city as part of his grand tour of Europe, and he liked it well enough to stay for 2 months. At a distance, Prague appeared magical, but up close, The city offended Morrison's nose. The handsome squares were piled with horse dung. The open sewers created a stench that he thought would repel a Turkish invasion far more effectively than the city's run-down fortifications. Morrison was also offended by the sight of men shamelessly pissing in the streets, and by the bohemian women who thought nothing of going unaccompanied to a tavern and drinking alongside the men. This unseemliness in no way stopped Fynes Morrison from having a fine old time among the Praguers. He drank wine and ate pickled oysters in a pub. He hiked up to Hradčany to witness a funeral at St. Vitus Cathedral and to inspect the outer walls of Rudolph's palace. Peering over the moat wall into the Emperor's garden, he spotted a dozen camels, a yak, and 2 leopards. The Golden Monkey. No part of Prague intrigued Fynes Morrison so much as the city's labyrinthine Jewish quarter. The little city of the Jews, he called it, where he observed a religious service, a funeral, and a circumcision in the synagogue. In Rudolph's time, the ghetto held close to 10,000 souls, living within a tight huddle of cramped streets, fetid canals, and slanted patchwork buildings of timber and stone. Still, the conditions of Jewish life had improved in recent decades, and Prague's reputation as an enlightened, tolerant city attracted talented Jewish scholars from all over Europe. Throughout the 16th century, new synagogues, public buildings, and houses sprung up in the ghetto, bringing a sense of pride and possibility to the inhabitants. A private family oratory on the edge of the Jewish cemetery was converted into a new temple, the Pinkas Synagogue, with a mix of late Gothic and Renaissance features. It was founded by Aaron Meshulam Horovitz, a prominent member of the community, and named after his grandson, Rabbi Pinkas Horovitz. But there's a Jewish folk tale in which the man who gave his name to the synagogue is remembered as a poor rag seller. Pinkas was a good and pious man, but he had no money. Every day he walked the streets of the Prague ghetto with a sack of old clothes that he sold to provide for his family. At the end of each day, he would hand over his few coins to his wife, eat some bread, and then study the Torah. A wealthy Bohemian count from the old town took pity on this honest man, and so each year he gave Pinkas a gold coin to pay for the Passover feast. When he received this generous gift, Pinkas would thank Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, for his good fortune. And this irritated the count, who thought he deserved at least some thanks for his charity. So when the holiday of Pesach came, the count told Pinkas, "It seems you have no need of my gold. God, who is good to you, will surely provide for you, since you always thank him so nicely." When Pinkas returned to his small home, his wife asked him how much the count had given him, and he pulled out 2 pieces of dust from his pockets. "How can we observe our duty to God and our family," she asked, "if we cannot buy food for the feast?" And at that moment, something smashed through the window and landed at their feet in a heap of broken glass. It was a dead monkey. Pinkas and his wife looked over the strange creature in horror and saw it had died in great pain. "What is the meaning of this?" he gasped. "And who threw it in here?" "We must get rid of it," said his wife, "or the rich man who owns it will think we stole it and killed it." "Yes, we must burn it," he said. But when Pinkas lifted up the dead monkey, gold coins fell from its open mouth. Pinkas then cut open the animal's belly, and more gold coins spilled from its gut. It was more gold than he had ever seen in his life, more than enough to hold the Passover feast. Pinkas and his wife thanked God for this miracle. The following morning, they went to the market and purchased flour to make the matzos, chicken bones for the soup, bitter herbs, and some wine. The children were given new clothes. The Count in the old town was surprised to hear that Pincus and his family had somehow managed to set a very fine table without his donation, and so he came to visit them in the Jewish quarter. "But how could you afford all this?" asked the Count. "Oh, I must tell you the truth," said Pincus. "Someone threw a dead monkey through my window. Its mouth and belly were full of gold coins." The Count asked to see the animal. He recognised the red collar around its neck. "But that monkey belonged to me," he said. "It died just yesterday." The Count thought for a moment. "I thought the monkey had been ill, but now I know what happened," he said slowly. "I am in the habit of testing gold coins by biting them. The wretched animal must have thought I was eating them and done the same. It swallowed too many coins, and that's what killed it." The Count looked at Pincus with a dawning understanding. "And my servants, when they found it dead, they must have wanted to play a trick on you. That's why they flung it through your window." The Count picked up his hat and coat and made his way to the door. "And now I no longer have any doubt that God helps you, Pincus," he said. "You should keep the money and enjoy it." And in gratitude for this unlikely fortune, Pincus built the synagogue in Prague that bears his name. After the Nazis were expelled from Prague in 1945, the Pincus Synagogue was remade as a memorial for the Czech Jewish people murdered in the Holocaust. The names of all 77,297 victims were inscribed in simple letters on the walls. Drawings made by the child inmates of Terezin concentration camp were put on display in glass cases. In 1968, the communist authorities closed the memorial, citing damage caused by humidity and damp. The regime lost interest in renovating the building, and the names of the dead were destroyed or damaged through neglect. After the Velvet Revolution, President Václav Havel made the restoration of the memorial a priority, and from 1992 to 1996, the names of the victims were carefully reinscribed on the walls. The wealthiest Jew in Rudolphine Prague was the financier Mordecai Maisel, who made himself indispensable to the emperor by advancing him substantial loans for his wars against the Ottoman Turks. Maisel also put his money to work beautifying the Jewish ghetto. In 1586, he financed the construction of a handsome Jewish town hall to be built in the Italian Renaissance style next to the old new synagogue. The most curious feature of Maisel's town hall is its 2 clocks. The tower is crowned with a conventional timepiece with Roman numerals, but just below on a scooped panel there is a Jewish clock, ringed with Hebrew letters. Just as Hebrew text runs from right to left, the arms of the Jewish clock run anti-clockwise. The 2 clocks are said to symbolise the tensions in Jewish life between the sacred and the secular, the particular and the universal, and the need to be distinctive and the longing to fit in. Mordecai Maisel had no children to inherit his wealth. By law, this meant that on his death, his money and property could be confiscated by the king. Rudolph, however, granted Maisel the right to dispose of his wealth as he saw fit. Maisel accordingly wrote a will, naming his relatives as beneficiaries. But when Maisel died in 1601, Rudolph reneged on his promise. Maisel's family was shocked by the emperor's betrayal, but could do nothing, as bailiffs carted off barrow loads of Maisel's gems, gold coins, silver candelabras, and fine fabrics from his house in the ghetto. The starry-eyed obsessions of the emperor had made a thief of him. Meisel was buried in the Jewish cemetery, and it was rumoured that his wife, Frumit, stashed a portion of her husband's treasure inside the stone memorial behind his headstone. Maharal. Close to Meisel's tomb is a pinkish gravestone crowned with a lion and a cluster of grapes, the symbol of a full, prosperous life. Here lies the body of Rabbi Yehuda ben Lev. Rabbi Lev was one of the great scholars of the Rudolphine era, who wrote many books on philosophy, ethics, and Jewish mysticism. For all his wisdom, he was at odds with the new spirit of the age. Far from being impressed by all the recent advances in mathematics, astronomy, and physiology, Rabbi Lev was convinced that the sum total of human knowledge had actually degenerated since the time of the ancient Jewish sages, and that the font of wisdom was slowly draining from the world. Rabbi Lev was spoken of as a tzaddik, a righteous scholar with special insights into the secrets of the cosmos. He was a master of the Jewish Kabbalah, a poetic system of thought that maps the correspondences between God and mortal beings. The rabbi's awe-struck disciples named him the Maharal of Prague, which is a contraction of the Hebrew Morenu Harav Lev into Maharal, which means our teacher, Rabbi Lev. At some point, the occult-obsessed emperor in the castle became aware the world's most admired Kabbalist scholar was living just across the river. And so on the 23rd of February 1592, Rudolf summoned Rabbi Lev so they might speak in his private residence. Neither man chose to reveal the substance of their conversation. The Maharal's deep understanding of the mysteries of the Torah and the Zohar, the book of Kabbalistic knowledge, gave credence to rumours of his magical powers. There was a story that the rabbi had stunned Rudolf by stopping his carriage on the Charles Bridge merely by raising his hand to it. When Christians tried to stone him, it was said the rabbi transmuted their rocks into butterflies. The magical deed most famously attributed to the rabbi is the creation of the Golem of Prague, an animated humanoid made from slops of mud scooped up from the banks of the Vltava River. The word golem appears only once in the Torah, where it denotes an unfinished human, something raw and crude. Adam, the first man, is the original golem, created from mud and kneaded into a shapeless husk. Golem legends were popular amongst Jewish communities in the Middle Ages, but the classic tale of the Prague golem does not originate in Bohemia, but in the romantic German folk tales of the 19th century. The name of the famous magic rabbi, the Maharal, served well enough for the necromancer of the story. According to the legend, Rabbi Lev decided to create the golem as a guardian to protect the Jews of Prague from a pogrom. One night, he and his two disciples wrapped themselves in white linen and carried their lanterns down to the banks of the Vltava. The Maharal, representing air, and his followers, representing fire and water, scooped up handfuls of river mud and sculpted it into a golem, which was earth. The men uttered prayers while circling the creature, and then the Maharal reached up and carved the word emet, the Hebrew word for truth, on its forehead. Into its mouth he placed a shem, a scrap of parchment with one of the 7 sacred names of God written upon it. And with that, the golem was brought to life. Rabbi Lev led the monster back to his house. By day, it served as a tireless domestic servant, and by night, it patrolled the ghetto, keeping the Jews safe from malicious Gentiles. But the rabbi's wife, Pearl, disliked it. she was troubled by its clay eyes and its dark face, which shone as though it had been greased with butter. And each day, she noticed, the golem grew a little taller. Every Friday on the eve of the Sabbath, the Maharal took care to remove the shem from the golem's mouth to render it inert. One week, the rabbi forgot, and the golem ran wild through the Jewish quarter, tearing down houses, pulling up trees, and thrashing about on the ground like a monstrous child. When the Maharal found the creature, he commanded it to be still. Then he ordered it to take off his boots. As the golem bent down, the rabbi erased the first letter of the word emet from its forehead, leaving only the word met, which means death, and the creature collapsed into a pile of mud. The sludge was shovelled into a trunk and carried up to the attic of the old new synagogue, where it was ordered never to be disturbed. The attic was sealed up and the uppermost stairs removed. In 1920, the Jewish reporter Egon Kisch, who had grown up with the golem legend, decided to see if there really was a chest of mud stashed inside the synagogue roof. One morning before dawn, he brought his mountain climbing gear to the old new synagogue, and seeing no one was around, he scaled the walls, removed a few roof tiles, and lowered himself into the attic. In the semi-darkness, he groped his way through the jagged ceiling arches. A bat crashed into his face, but otherwise, he discovered nothing. Kisch, who was both a communist and an atheist, declared his mission to be a success. But in publishing the story in the Prague press, he accepted he had unwittingly brought it back to life. The golem was popularised in the early 20th century by Gustav Meyrink's fever dream of a novel and by Paul Wegener's classic silent film, where the director played the title role himself. In 1938, as the Nazi threat loomed over Prague, Egon Kisch wished he could summon the golem to protect the city. I too, he said, would give the command, "Arise and go! Our enemies are closing in on my Prague." The name of the lady. Just as Kabbalism thrived in the Jewish quarter, a similar occult movement took hold in Rudolph's castle, a discipline whose ideals were expressed in the pages of a strange and baffling book titled The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz. The author was unknown. The book told the tale of a German knight, Christian Rosenkreutz, who receives a mysterious invitation to assist at the wedding of a king and queen. At the royal castle, Christian and an assortment of other guests are subject to a set of punishing ordeals to test their fitness to attend the ceremony. Presiding over these tests is an otherworldly woman in a majestic red velvet dress with a white ribbon around her waist. Her head is crowned with a green laurel wreath. On the evening of the third day at the castle, after a fine dinner, Christian is emboldened to ask the woman in the red dress for her name. And she answers with a riddle. My name contains 5 and 50, yet only has 8 letters. The third is a third part of the 5th. If it is added to the 6th, they make a number whose root exceeds the first letter by as much as the third itself and is half of the 4th. The 5th and 7th are equal, and the last is equal to the first, and these make as much with the second as the 6th, which is just 4 more than thrice the third. Now tell me, sir, what is my name? Christian turns her riddle over in his mind, but is hopelessly caught in its intricacies. He can see it's a simple code, A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, and so on. But the riddle is sealed inside itself and cannot yield an answer. So he politely asks the lady if she will provide him with a single clue. She smiles graciously and agrees. He asks for the value of the 7th letter, and she replies, "As many as the gentlemen here." Having counted 9 gentlemen, Christian is soon able to correctly decipher the lady's name. The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz was both an allegorical romance and a manifesto of an occult art that was the great passion of the age. Its name was concealed in the lady's riddle: alchemia. Alchemy offered its practitioners nothing less than the means to transmute base metals into gold and to attain everlasting youth. Rudolph II, endlessly curious, always short of gold, and terrified of death, found the glitter of this noble art irresistible, and he refitted the powder tower on the north wall of his castle as an alchemical workshop. The emperor was most likely introduced to alchemy by his personal physician, Dr. Tadeusz Hayek, a brilliant polymath who lived in the house at the Green Mound on Bethlehem Square. Hayek's workshop was an alchemist's dream, its walls richly decorated with gold inscriptions, hieroglyphs, and pictures of birds, flowers, and fruits. Hayek and his fellow alchemists spent years attempting to process metals like mercury and lead through a multi-staged ordeal of heating, cooling, mixing, and distillation so as to bring their essential qualities into play with each other. The ultimate goal was to create a primordial substance known as the philosopher's stone, the transformative agent that could transmute base substances into the noble metals of gold and silver and could act as an elixir of life. The quest for the philosopher's stone was known as the magnum opus, the great work. It was, of course, a frustratingly futile endeavour. But the struggle itself was meaningful. The working of metals was supposed to mirror a process of inner transformation, a distillation of the gold of the human soul. Humility and imagination were essential ingredients. Would-be adepts could never find their way by sticking to the straight line of deductive reasoning. Instead, they had to enter a labyrinth that confounded linear logic and which called upon intuition and humility, the golden thread of Ariadne, to reveal the true path. Christian Rosenkreutz was wise to humbly ask the lady for a clue, because arrogant logic was not enough to decipher her riddle. A gift of grace was required to unlock it. The month after I left post-revolutionary Prague, I found an edition of 16th century alchemical drawings in a second-hand bookshop on London's Charing Cross Road. The images were weirdly beautiful and clearly allegorical, but they thwarted my attempts to unpick their meaning. On one page I saw a gigantic glass vessel floating upon a body of water. Inside the flask, a naked man and woman embraced as the sun and moon looked on from the rocks nearby. In the neck of the flask, I could see a child, or was it a cherub, floating above the couple, and a 9-branched tree sprouted up from the child's head above the rim. I knew well enough that there might be some correspondence between man, woman, sun, moon, and that the glass flask obviously denoted some kind of chemical process. But otherwise I was clueless as to its meaning, if it had one. The images seemed to burn with the need to communicate something important, but inexplicable. Eventually, I saw that these enigmatic diagrams are intended to function as a kind of mandala, a graphic device that's designed to pin down rational thought and allow the subconscious mind to come forth and throw out flashes of creative insight that might later be identified as intuition or divine revelation. Alchemy traces its origins to 4th century Alexandria, where goldsmiths and metalworkers became proficient in dyeing metal alloys to make them look like gold. What began as a marketplace scam inspired a whole body of mystical thought that suddenly made grand claims for its vast antiquity. In Alexandria, it was said that the secrets of alchemy had been brought to earth by fallen angels who had passed them on to their earthly wives. Such ambitious work had to be undertaken in great secrecy. Mysteries made public become cheap, and things profaned lose their grace, warned the narrator of The Chemical Wedding. The master alchemists therefore encoded their work in densely symbolic language to keep them safe from the greedy, the unimaginative, and the impatient. But sincere practitioners of the art were inevitably frustrated in their attempts at transmutation. The secretive culture of the alchemists concealed their failures. The Renaissance obsession with alchemy is now widely regarded as an embarrassing dead end, a stumbling block of medieval obscurantism that delayed the arrival of genuine science. Scholars would have to wait until the Enlightenment before the invisible College of Arcane Knowledge would finally give way to the open academy, the scientific method, and evidence-based chemistry. In Rudolph's time, sincere alchemists were outnumbered by charlatans, who were known as puffers, who came to Prague hoping to win the emperor's patronage. One such puffer, a Greek Cypriot named Marmunia of Famagusta, strode through the streets of the old town with a pair of black mastiffs, brandishing nuggets of gold that he claimed to have made himself. Another, named Geronimo Scotta, made a spectacular entry into Prague with 3 red velvet carriages drawn by 40 horses. But he soon lost his money and his reputation and ended up selling potions from a booth in the old town square. The deepest and holiest dream of alchemy was the chemical wedding itself, the refinement of the soul through the sacred marriage of opposites, male and female, sun and moon, sulphur and mercury. The wedding releases the better self, the uncommon gold that lies within. It's a demanding process, as Christian Rosenkreutz discovers, one that chimes with F. Scott Fitzgerald's famous test of a first-rate intelligence: the ability to hold 2 opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Magus. For Rudolph's domestic servants, the chilly castle must have been an unsettling place to work, with sulphurous smoke trailing from the powder tower, portraits of naked women hanging from the walls, and hungry lions padding through the hallways. Scientists and alchemists came to and from the palace. What purpose did all this strangeness signify? Was their master in league with the devil? In early August 1584, word spread through the city that the famous English magus, Dr. John Dee, had come to Prague, along with his companion, the Irish seer and alchemist Edward Kelly. Tadeusz Hayek, who had long corresponded with Dee, invited them to lodge with him in his house at the Green Mound and offered them the use of his alchemical workshop. Dr. Dee was a genuine scholar, highly regarded across Europe for his work as a mathematician and a geographer. But his current work with Kelly made such pursuits seem mundane. The 2 men for some years now, had been communicating with angels. John Dee was born in London and educated at Cambridge University, where arithmetic had led him to numerology, astronomy to astrology, and the natural sciences to alchemy. His reputation as a master magician was established at Trinity College, where he engineered a stunning stage effect for a production of an Aristophanes play by creating a gigantic winged scarab beetle that flew around the auditorium. The audience was astonished, and afterwards he was denounced as a sorcerer. Dee insisted the effect was arrived at, quote, naturally, mathematically, and mechanically, hinting at the use of wheels and pulleys. After establishing his reputation as a mathematician on the continent, Dee returned to his home at Mortlake in Surrey, where he established a library that was said to be the largest repository of books on the natural sciences and the occult in England. As one of the most learned scholars in the realm, Dr. Dee was called upon to give cartographic advice for an expedition to find a northwest passage across the Americas to Europe. Elizabeth I invited Dee to cast the royal horoscope and to advise her on the most auspicious day for her coronation. Dee's reputation in London was such that Shakespeare modelled his character Prospero from The Tempest on him. In the 1580s, Dee concluded that no man or book could bring him the wisdom that he longed for, so he looked for shortcuts to knowledge through his occult research. Like other scholars at the time, Dee believed that God had imbued all things with the radiant light of creation, and that such rays could be gathered and focused in polished crystals. These crystal showstones required a sensitive medium, or scryer, to summon otherworldly visions from their depths. There was no sin in this. Scrying, he believed, was a form of natural magic, which was wholly different from diabolical magic proffered by powerful demons. Indeed, with his showstone, Dee hoped to redeem all of humanity from its alienation from God. Dee thought that the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden had resulted in a breakdown of communication with heaven. And since then, humans had only been able to understand the Creator dimly and imperfectly. By communing with angels through his crystal showstone, Dee hoped to recover this sublime, lost language and resume the broken conversation between God and his creation. Dee's first scryers had proved unsatisfactory, but in 1582, a stranger arrived at his door offering his services. The visitor introduced himself as Edward Talbot, but afterwards revealed his true name, Edward Kelly. Edward Kelly, who was 30 years younger than Dee, was a charismatic and imaginative charlatan. Very little is known of his early life. At some point, both his ears had been lopped off by the authorities for forgery, a disfigurement that he tried to conceal by wearing a cap with long side flaps. Edward Kelly took little time to deduce the secret desire within John Dee's heart. He read Dee's diary and tantalised him by feeding parts of it back to him through the visions he reported seeing in the showstone. Kelly's first contact was with the archangel Uriel, and this greatly excited Dee. Uriel, he believed, had given the language of creation to Noah's ancestor Enoch. Dee and Kelly settled into a routine of regular scrying. Kelly would describe the lurid visions and voices he perceived, and Dee would put questions to the angels who appeared in the crystal. Kelly conjured up all kinds of rich images, a book with text written in blood on golden pages, an angel eating red fruit from a flourishing tree, and this persuaded Dee that Kelly was genuine. Dee kept a detailed account of these sessions in his occult diary. It was later published as A True and Faithful Relation of What Passed for Many Years Between Dr. John Dee and Some Spirits. Word of Dee and Kelly's sensational breakthrough soon spread throughout Europe. In 1583, Count Albert Laski of Poland, a patron of alchemists and seers, invited the two men to come with him to his estate in Krakow and to bring their families. Dee, who feared he was out of favour with Queen Elizabeth and her court, was only too happy to accept. On the 21st of September, the two families slipped out of Mortlake under cover of darkness and boarded a ship bound for the continent. After passing through Rotterdam and Bremen, they made their way down to Krakow. The sojourn in Poland was a disappointment all round. Kelly, who had presented himself to Lasky as a master alchemist, failed to produce the elixir of life as he had promised, and the Count, he was running out of money. At the same time, the angels in the Showstone were telling Dee he must go to Prague to warn the Emperor Rudolf to renounce his sinfulness, lest the angels pull him down from his throne. The prospect was terrifying. Who was Dee to say such a thing to the Holy Roman Emperor? But the angels were insistent, and so on the 1st of August, 1584, he and Kelly set out on the long carriage ride to Prague. At their first séance in the house at the Green Mound, Kelly said he saw a gaping furnace mouth blasting out smoke and a seething lake of black pitch. Then he said he saw an angel named Madimi appearing in the shape of a girl in a green and red gown, who uttered a litany of warnings. Woe be to women great with child, for they shall bring forth monsters. Woe be unto the kings of the earth, for they shall be beaten in a mortar. Once again, Dee was told he must confront the emperor and rebuke him for his sins. But this time, Madimi raised the stakes. She told Dee that the son of darkness would kill his children and drive his wife to suicide if he didn't comply. Kelly's motives here are unclear. It's impossible to know whether the angels' apocalyptic warnings came from his psychotic state of mind or from a desire to torment his partner, or if he simply enjoyed engineering such confrontations to see what would come of them. In any case, at the angel's insistence, Dr. Dee penned a letter to Rudolf asking for an audience, and on the 3rd of September, a message arrived at the house at the Green Mound telling him to come to the palace at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Dee arrived at Prague Castle without Kelly, who had drunk too much wine the night before and was nursing wounds from a fist fight. Dee got lost wandering through the castle labyrinth until Rudolf's chamberlain found him and brought him into the emperor's offices. Dee found Rudolf sitting impassively at a table with a copy of his book, Monus Hieroglyphica, which Dee had donated to Rudolf's father decades earlier. After introductory formalities, Rudolf came right to the point and said he believed that Dee had a message to communicate to him. "So I have," said the Englishman, who looked around and, seeing they were alone, took a deep breath and told Rudolf that the angel of the Lord had ordered him to rebuke the emperor for his sins. "The angel of the Lord hath appeared to me, and rebuketh you for your sins. If you will hear me and believe me, you shall triumph. If you will not hear me, the Lord, the God that made heaven and earth, under whom you breathe and have your spirit, putteth his foot against your breast, and will throw you headlong down from your seat." However, Dee said, If the emperor was ready to forsake his wickedness, then the Lord would make him great and deliver him victory against the great Turk. If the emperor was offended by Dee's audacity, he did not show it. Speaking softly, he told Dee that he believed him and offered a vague promise that he would take him into his care. Rudolf indicated the audience was concluded, and Dee respectfully made his exit. After Dee left the castle, a suspicious Rudolf sent a courtier, Jakob Kurtz, to call on Dee at the house at the Green Mound. Kurtz spoke with Dee for 6 hours on the nature of his research, while Kelly sulked in his bedroom. Courtier was unimpressed, and after he delivered his report, the emperor let it be known there would be no more invitations to the castle. Rudolf's Catholic advisers feared that Dee was consorting with evil spirits, and they suspected that he might be acting as an English spy on behalf of Queen Elizabeth's principal secretary, Sir Francis Walsingham. Dee and Kelly decamped to Trzeboń, south of Prague, to the castle of Willem of Rosenberg, who offered them the use of his alchemical laboratory. At Trzeboń, relations between Dee and Kelly deteriorated. Dee was beginning to suspect his sidekick was a charlatan, but the old man had come so far down the road of angelology with him, it was unthinkable to admit their years of hard work amounted to nothing more than fantasy. 3 months after their arrival at Trzeboń, Kelly announced he had produced a tiny granular speck of the Philosopher's Stone. Soon afterwards, he told Dee that he had used this granule to transmute a small amount of mercury into an ounce of gold. Rumours of his achievement spread quickly, and suddenly it was Kelly, not Dee, who was the star magus and alchemist of Europe. Spiritual gurus, as they ascend ever closer to the Godhead, all too often come back down the mountain with a holy writ to reorder the sex lives of their followers. In April 1587, Edward Kelly told Dr. Dee that the angel Madimi had appeared in the showstone and had shocked him by parting her cloak to reveal her nakedness. Then, Kelly said, she had commanded both men to cross-match with each other's wives. Dee, who loved his young wife Jane dearly, became distressed, and he begged Jesus and the Holy Spirit for help. But Madimi rebuked him for his insolence and told him that all things are permitted to the godly. That night as he went to bed, Dee told Jane mournfully that he could see no other remedy other than to submit to the angel's demand. Jane wept and trembled, but agreed to do as she was asked. Dee drafted a covenant that expressed everyone's willingness to put aside their bewilderment and to bow to this most new and strange doctrine, which he said was above human reason. 2 weeks later, Dee wrote a terse entry in his diary. Pactum factum. Pact fulfilled. 40 weeks after the covenant was concluded, Jane gave birth to a son. Dee agreed to raise the boy as his own and said nothing more about the matter. Kelly tried to raise his spirits by producing a liquid that he called divine water, but it failed to act as promised. Nonetheless, the reputation of Kelly the alchemist, an angel interlocutor, continued to grow as Dee's reputation began to fade. In January 1589, his host, Willem of Rosenberg, made it clear that Dee had outstayed his welcome. Dee and his family returned to England, where he was appointed warden of Manchester College. Kelly, now very much in demand, was warmly welcomed back to Prague by Rudolf, who gave him the use of the workshop in the Powder Tower. The English ambassador observed Kelly at work and was completely convinced the Irishman had cracked the secret of transmutation. He claimed he'd seen Kelly produce perfect gold from base metal, which he said came forth in great projection. The delighted emperor made Kelly a Baron of Bohemia and awarded him with several estates. Rudolf now awaited a stream of gold to flow from Kelly's workshop. But when it failed to materialise, he concluded he'd been duped and he threw Kelly into prison. Kelly was released 2 years later, but was arrested again after a fight with a rival alchemist. The circumstances of his subsequent death are unknown. There were rumours that he'd faked his own suicide or that he'd fallen from a tower window trying to escape. In any case, there are no further reports of him after 1598. Rudolf turned to other alchemists in the hope of finding the elusive philosopher's stone, and to his astronomers to decode the mysteries of the heavens. The Empire of the Stars. The most celebrated astronomer in Europe was the Danish aristocrat Tycho Brahe. Tycho was a man of striking appearance, with closely cropped red hair, small black eyes, and a long walrus moustache. As a younger man, he had fought a duel and come away with the foremost part of his nose sliced off. He concealed this disfigurement with a prosthetic nose made from an amalgam of silver and gold, which he attached daily to his face with a dab of adhesive. Tycho had been educated in the ancient traditions of astronomy, which assumed that the Earth sat at the centre of an unchanging cosmos, and that the planets rotated across the sky inside vast transparent spheres. The outermost sphere contained the sparkling stars. Astronomers were taught that the heavens were not open and spacious, but glassy and solid. The concept was poetic, but it cramped the imagination. The crystalline spheres kept the Earth encased within a crystal orb, like a cosmic snow dome. Tycho's meticulous observations of the night sky put a major crack in those heavenly spheres. In 1572, he spotted a new star in the Cassiopeia constellation where none had existed before, an event that should have been impossible, according to the ancient wisdom. This was a supernova, a dying star, blowing out gargantuan amounts of gas, light and heat. Although more than 7,500 million light years from Earth, it shone more brightly in the sky than our neighbouring planet Venus. Tycho published his detailed observations in a book, De Nova Stella, which overturned the ancient consensus of an unchanging universe and opened the skies. There was a dawning awareness that our world is not fixed inside a rotating crystal mechanism, but positioned in open space that humans might conceivably pass through one day on their way to other worlds. A contemporary said of Tycho that he subdued with his rare spirit the empire of the stars. The dramatic appearance of this new star made it clear that a new model of the cosmos was required, using better and more accurate instruments to record its movements. To that end, the Danish king Frederick II gave Tycho an island in the strait between Denmark and Sweden, where Tycho built the world's most advanced observatory that he named Uraniborg, after Urania, the muse of astronomy. Tycho ruled his island like a medieval potentate, entertaining his guests with riotous, drunken banquets, attended by Jep, his dwarf jester, whom he believed could see into the future, and his beer-drinking pet moose. But after Frederick's death, Tycho fell out with the new king, Christian IV, and in 1597 he was obliged to abandon Uraniborg. Tycho and his entourage wandered through Europe until Tadeusz Hayek urged Rudolf to invite him to Prague. Rudolf wrote a flattering letter to Tycho, offering to appoint him imperial mathematician with a castle of his choice and a salary that was much higher than any palace courtier. Sorely in need of a new patron, Tycho set out in 1599 with his two sons to pay a visit to the emperor. On arriving at Prague Castle, Tycho was given the honour of meeting the emperor alone. The two conversed in Latin, but Rudolf spoke so softly, Tycho had difficulty at times picking up what was said. Tycho then presented 3 books of his astronomical observations to Rudolf, which delighted the emperor. For his new observatory, Tycho selected a mansion on a huge estate 36 kilometres northeast of Prague named Benátky. He invited students to live there and assist him in his work, which included supplying the emperor with regularly updated horoscopes. At the time, astronomy and astrology were firmly bonded fields of study. Astronomy focused on celestial mechanics, while astrology was concerned with the meaning of those mechanics and the influence of the heavens on the course of human events. Tycho Brahe was one of the last great astronomers to make his observations without a telescope, and he was among the last to hold fast to the dying idea that the Earth sat fixed at the centre of the cosmos. Tycho knew of Copernicus's new model, which established the sun at the centre, but he chose not to fully accept it. Instead, he came up with a dizzyingly complicated hybrid theory that had all the other planets revolving around the sun, but with the sun and everything else still revolving around the Earth, which remained fixed in the divinely ordained centre of things. Although Tycho's model was hopelessly wrong, the body of data he'd gathered over 20 years on the motion of heavenly bodies was invaluable for its volume and its precision. His oversized instruments identified the positions of the stars to within an arc minute, which allowed him to measure planetary movements with an accuracy never previously attempted. But Tycho's stubborn loyalty to his flawed cosmological model left him unable to do anything much with this mountain of data. Tycho's achievements were to be outshone by the man he invited to join him at Benátky, a pock-marked German astronomer with poor eyesight named Johannes Kepler. Johannes Kepler, despite his various ailments and afflictions, was buoyed all his life by an indestructible optimism that carried him through his travails and the numerous dead ends of his scientific research. Kepler saw the world as a labyrinth of puzzles created by God, who had happily endowed him with the intellect to solve them. For Kepler, human curiosity was as natural and as beautiful as birdsong. "We do not ask for what useful purpose the birds do sing," he wrote, "for song is their pleasure, since they were created for singing. Similarly, we ought not to ask why the human mind troubles to fathom the secrets of the heavens." Johannes Kepler was born in the German town of Weil der Stadt on the edge of the Black Forest in 1571. Kepler's father, whom he barely knew, was a mercenary, and his mother was a healer and a herbalist who was rumoured to be a witch. The young Kepler astonished his elders with his easy grasp of complex mathematical concepts. Putting aside his ambition to become a Lutheran minister, Kepler took up a teaching job in the Austrian city of Graz, where he pondered the movement of the planets. Unlike Tycho, Kepler was an early and enthusiastic convert to Copernicus's heliocentric model that put the sun at the centre. But he wasn't satisfied to merely annotate the position of heavenly bodies. The clockwork motion of the planets appeared to suggest a grand design, a hidden set of principles. What is it that determines the space between the planets? And why do they move at different speeds? One day, while in the classroom, Kepler was struck by a powerful idea. He suddenly imagined that the spaces between the orbits of the planets might be represented by a set of 5 perfectly symmetrical solid shapes: the triangular pyramid, the cube, the octahedron, the dodecahedron, and the icosahedron, nested inside each other like a set of Russian dolls. This, he was sure, explained why there were 6 planets with 5 spaces between them. In Kepler's time, Uranus and Neptune had not yet been identified as the 7th and 8th planets. Kepler's excitement doubled when he realised that when placed within a sphere, every point of these perfect solids would touch the inside surface of the sphere simultaneously. And this, he thought, implied an essential relationship between these perfect shapes and spherical planetary motion. "It is amazing," he wrote giddily. Within a few days, everything fell into place. Kepler's splendid model of the architecture of the cosmos was poetic, but entirely wrong. Nonetheless, he spent years attempting to shoehorn the observational data into it. The flash of inspiration had been so galvanizing, it seemed to Kepler to have been seared into his mind by God himself, a notion that carried him through all the troubling inconsistencies that were to follow. Kepler presented his model in his first book, Mysterium Cosmographicum, which he published at the age of 25. He sent a copy to Tycho Brahe, and the two began a lively correspondence. Tycho told Kepler he would be welcome if he chose to come and work with him. In 1598, Archduke Ferdinand of Styria decreed that all Protestant teachers were to be banished from Graz. Taking Tycho Brahe at his word, Kepler, along with his wife and children, made their way to Prague. When Tycho Brahe heard of Kepler's arrival, he sent a message at once, inviting him to live and work with him at Benátky. "You will come not so much as a guest," Tycho wrote, "than as a very welcome friend and colleague in the contemplation of the skies." Kepler duly arrived at Benátky a few weeks later, but the grandiose Dane soon clashed with the touchy schoolmaster. Tycho was more standoffish than his letter implied, and his assistants treated Kepler like a domestic servant. Tycho asked Kepler to study the orbit of Mars, a task that both excited and maddened him. Mars's trajectory across the sky seemed perverse. The planet would sail along and then slow down, come to a halt, then retrace its steps, and then resume its former course. Kepler knew that Tycho's storehouse of thousands of sturdy little data bricks would allow him to construct a better and a more truthful model of planetary motion than Tycho's absurd and convoluted theory, if only he could be allowed full access to them. But Tycho peevishly hoarded his data and passed it out in dribs and drabs. The shabby treatment wore away at Kepler's self-esteem till he could bear it no longer, and he presented Tycho with a list of demands. He said he wanted a regular, substantial salary and a separate apartment where he could work undisturbed by Tycho's raucous dinner parties. Tycho was ready to reach a settlement, but at dinner Kepler drank too much and insulted his host. Tycho became indignant, and then Kepler stormed off to Prague the next morning. A week later, having calmed down, Kepler sent Tycho an abject apology via Dr. Jasenius, the anatomist, who would become his close friend. "What shall I mention first?" Kepler wrote. my lack of self-control, which I can only remember with the greatest pain, or your benefactions, noblest Tycho, which can neither be enumerated nor valued according to merit. With a weary sigh, Tycho came to Prague and, in a fatherly manner, offered Kepler a ride back to Benátky in his coach. He promised Kepler he would pay him a proper salary. The two men had come to accept that they needed each other and would both have to try harder to get along. Tycho had hoped that the distance between Benátky and Prague would keep Rudolf from interrupting his work, but the anxious emperor had come to depend on his astrological forecasts, and he ordered Tycho to relocate to Prague to be close at hand. Tycho, with the greatest reluctance, assented and installed his instruments on the terrace of the Belvedere in the royal gardens. Tycho's dyspeptic mood might have influenced the bleak horoscope that he delivered to Rudolf in early 1600. The stars, he bluntly told the emperor, indicated that he would likely be assassinated within a few years. Rudolf, shocked to the core, became even more isolated, hardly venturing beyond the Kunstkammer and his private quarters, clutching at his treasured unicorn horn and holy grail. More mindful now of his sensitive deputy, Tycho brought Kepler to Prague Castle in October 1601 to introduce him to the emperor and to inform him that they had begun a new great work, a comprehensive tabulation of the position of the stars and planets, and that they wished to dedicate this work to him. The proposal pleased Rudolf immensely and lifted his gloom somewhat. 2 weeks later, Tycho Brahe was dead. The account of Tycho's strange death was recorded in Kepler's diary. Both men had been invited to a supper at Peter Vogt of Rosenberg's mansion in Huradchany. Rosenberg was a generous, gregarious host, and Tycho drank heavily. According to Kepler, Tycho needed to relieve his aching bladder, but the rules of etiquette required him to stay at his place at the table until the host had risen. Kepler wrote, "Holding his urine longer than was his habit, Brahe remained seated. Although he drank a little over generously and experienced pressure on his bladder, he felt less concern for his state of health than for the demands of courtesy. By the time Brahe returned home, he could not urinate any more. He spent 5 days without sleep. Finally, with the most excruciating pain, he barely passed some urine, and yet it was blocked. Uninterrupted insomnia followed, intestinal fever, and little by little, delirium." As he lay on his deathbed, Tycho begged Kepler repeatedly, "Please, let me not have lived in vain." He wanted Kepler to confirm his hybrid planetary model, a request that Kepler couldn't possibly accede to in good faith. On the 24th of October, the delirium subsided momentarily, and then Tycho expired. For centuries after his death, Kepler was suspected of having poisoned Tycho, but modern forensic investigations have revealed that the probable cause of death was uremic poisoning caused by a damaged kidney. Rudolf was devastated by the loss of his imperial mathematician, and he arranged a grand funeral for him at the Teen Church. Tycho's remains were encased in a red marble tomb in the church's nave, where they lie today. 2 days later, the emperor named Kepler as his new imperial mathematician, entrusting him with the responsibility of completing the Rudolphine tables. The salary was a fraction of the sum granted to Tycho, but it did allow Kepler to move his family into a fine house in Prague's new town. Kepler now embarked on the most fruitful period of his career. In between devising horoscopes for the emperor, Kepler kept puzzling over the question of the maddeningly eccentric passage of Mars. If the heavens were open and airy, Kepler wondered, what force was governing their orbits? Perhaps, he thought, the planets were living entities with world souls, whizzing through the heavens like spaceships. But if that was so and the planets were living things, how did they chart their course without clear markers to guide them? Kepler reasoned that the sun must be emanating some kind of invisible force at a distance, like magnetism, holding the planets in their orbits and sweeping them along. But here he ran into a problem with Copernicus's new model. To make his computations work, Copernicus had done something odd. He had placed the focal point of planetary motion not in the heart of the sun, but at the centre of the Earth's orbit, which, intriguingly, was offset from the centre of the sun. How could this be possible if the Earth's orbit was being managed by the invisible exertions of the sun? Was there a second force at work? Step by step, Kepler pulled out all the flawed assumptions of ancient astronomy and arrived at last at a transformative idea: that the shape of planetary motion is driven not by one, but by two dynamic forces, one based in the sun and the other within the planet itself. Kepler imagined that these dynamic forces create dual focal points at the centre of the solar system, which shape the orbits of the planets, not as a perfect circle, but as an ellipse, a slightly elongated circle. Kepler tested this elliptical model with Tycho's observational data and was overjoyed when they fitted together perfectly. I felt as if I had been awakened from a sleep, he wrote later.
This is the end of CD 5. The book continues on CD 6. CD 6.
Having been dignified with the title of imperial mathematician, Kepler's social status in Prague rose accordingly, and he took to wearing fine black silk and ruffled collars. Kepler was pleased to be invited into the mansions of several noble families, although he was too embarrassed by his relatively modest home to return their hospitality. Still, he was dogged by petty troubles. His health was poor, and his salary was paid only intermittently, which forced him to go begging to the imperial authorities, who came to regard him as a bit of a nuisance. Kepler wrangled for years with Tycho's estate for access to his astronomical data, and he argued constantly with his wife, who refused to touch a penny of her dowry when money ran short. Nonetheless, in 1608, Kepler was ready to publish his magnum opus on planetary motion that he titled Astronomia Nova, the New Astronomy. But he was so short of funds, he had to forfeit the entire first edition to the printer to cover the costs. Putting aside any resentment he may have had over his unpaid salary, Kepler dedicated the book to Rudolf and generously paid tribute to Tycho's work in the title. A new astronomy based on causation, or a physics of the sky derived from investigations of the motions of the star Mars, founded on observations of the noble Tycho Brahe. In his book, Kepler set out his first two laws of planetary motion, which are, put very simply, 1. The planets travel around the Sun in elliptical orbits, with the Sun located at one of the two focal points. 2. Planets travel more quickly the nearer they are to the Sun. Later, Kepler arrived at his third principle, the one that pleased him the most, a mathematical formula that relates the orbital period of the planets to their distances from the Sun. Armed with these three principles, an astronomer could accurately predict where a planet would be at any time in the future. It was the greatest scientific achievement of the Rudolphine era. Of all the brilliant minds that came to Rudolph's Prague, it was the awkward schoolmaster whose mind travelled furthest into the heavens. In 1608, Kepler achieved another breakthrough of sorts by creating the world's first work of science fiction, a short story that was titled Somnium, or The Dream. The story tells the tale of a young man from Iceland, the son of a witch, who studies astronomy in Denmark under the great Tycho Brahe. When the young man returns to Iceland, his mother introduces him to a demon who tells him of his regular flights to the moon and of the bizarre creatures that live on its surface. Kepler wrote Somnium to shift the imagination of his readers towards the Copernican system. He wanted them to appreciate that if the Earth could be seen from the moon, then it would appear to be moving through space like the other planets. But the most wonderful aspect of his story is its joyful description of space flight. Humans would have to wait another 360 years before astronauts could behold an Earthrise from the lunar surface. But it was Johannes Kepler who imagined the possibility of such a moment in the first place. I know that I am dead and damned. By 1608, when Kepler was writing Somnium, his emperor had become a lonely, embattled figure. He had tried to allay Christian infighting by calling on all Christendom to unite in the common struggle against the Ottoman Sultan, who had resumed hostilities against him in 1593. But the war was dragging on, leaving large tracts of Hungary and Transylvania ravaged and lawless. Rudolf, remembering Tycho's prediction, feared being assassinated, not at the hands of Protestants, but from Catholic hardliners, who suspected that he'd become a Protestant sympathiser like his father. The English diplomat Henry Wotton reported to London that a Flemish priest had been discovered in the emperor's privy chamber with a crossbow hidden in his wide sleeve. I know that I am dead and damned, Rudolf told his valet. I am a man possessed by the devil. This confession was duly passed on to the papal nuncio and to Rudolf's family in Vienna and Madrid. Stoking his paranoia, they persuaded him to sack several long-serving Protestant councillors in his court and replace them with militant Catholics. In 1606, a riot in the Protestant city of Donauwörth provoked Rudolf into purging the local council and replacing its members with reliable Catholics. In response, the Protestant principalities within the empire formed the Evangelical Union, a military alliance against Catholic aggression. And the empire's Catholic princes, led by Maximilian of Bavaria, felt obliged to set up their own Catholic League. The Evangelical Union looked to France for support, while the Catholic League looked to Spain. It was Rudolf's job to hold this collection of princes together, but the only firm point of agreement between them now was that he should go. In 1606, Rudolf's scheming younger brother Matthias convened a meeting of the Habsburg archdukes, intending to tear from him the sceptre and the crown. The archdukes were particularly offended by Rudolf's obsession with the occult, and they denounced him in a letter that they all signed. His Majesty is interested only in wizards, alchemists, Kabbalists and the like, sparing no expense to find all kinds of treasures, learn secrets, and use scandalous ways of harming his enemies. He also has a whole library of magic books. He strives all the time to eliminate God completely so that he may, in future, serve a different master. The rebellious archdukes named Matthias as the new head of the Habsburg family and called for the emperor to name him as his successor. Rudolf bowed to their wishes and appointed Matthias governor of Hungary. The Hungarians were at that time in a state of armed revolt against the empire, and Rudolf probably hoped to entangle his younger brother in an intractable mess. But Matthias quickly forged a settlement with the Hungarian rebels and the Ottoman Empire by the simple expedient of granting them everything they asked for, and then leaving his older brother to find the money to pay for it. Rudolf was ready to overrule him, but he had made too many enemies. In March 1608, the Moravian estates declared their support for Matthias, as did the estates of Hungary and Austria. On the 3rd of May, Matthias arrived at the Bohemian border at the head of a 20,000-strong army ready to depose his brother and take his place. Rudolf summoned an assembly of the Bohemian estates to ask for their support. The emperor, now 55, stepped into the chamber stooped and downcast. In his thin, small voice, he apologised for being too ill to preside over the session, and then shuffled back out of the room. The price of peace with his brother was to surrender most of his empire to him. Matthias was to be awarded Austria, Hungary, and Moravia, while Rudolf was permitted to retain Bohemia, Silesia, Lusatia, and the imperial crown. The Protestant nobles of Bohemia used this moment to exploit Rudolf's weakness by extracting a guarantee of religious freedom in return for their support. Rudolf had no alternative but to concede, and on the 9th of July 1609 he signed a Letter of Majesty, a Charter of Rights, which allowed Protestants to open churches and schools as they wished. Protestants of Bohemia rejoiced, believing they had secured their liberties. But Rudolf resented having his arm twisted in this manner, and with his enemies closing in, he resolved on a last desperate gamble, and he reached out to his nephew, Leopold, the Bishop of Passau, in neighbouring Bavaria. Leopold was more of a reckless adventurer than he was a holy man. He had an army of 10,000 mercenaries at his disposal across the border. In 1610, Leopold wrote to Rudolf asking permission to bring them into Bohemia for the winter. Waving aside all advice to the contrary, Rudolf enthusiastically consented, hoping the presence of his nephew's troops would make it easier to stare down his enemies. In early 1611, with Rudolf's blessing, Leopold and his Passauer army crossed the border into southern Bohemia and made their way towards Prague. The Passauer mercenaries, underpaid and poorly disciplined, plundered every town they passed through. Prague's civic leaders pleaded with the emperor to order the Passauers to turn back. Rudolf, who preferred to wave his sword around rather than to strike with it, consented, but the mercenaries were now off the leash and refusing to be restrained. On the 13th of February, sentries at Prague Castle spotted the approaching Passauer army. In the old town, the teen church bells sounded the alarm, creating panic in the streets. Groups of men and women gathered stones and carts to set up a barricade at the bridge tower. The Passauers pulled up outside the western ramparts of the city. That night, they blasted through the walls with a concentrated burst of artillery fire, and the soldiers streamed into Malastrana and Hradčany, pillaging one house after the other. By 10 o'clock the next morning, Malastrana was a burning wreck. Dead bodies littered the streets. From their high point on Hradčany, the Passauer artillery fired a barrage of cannonballs across the river into the old town. Leopold's mercenaries regrouped to cross the Vltava, but as they funnelled onto the bridge, they came under heavy fire from the tower and the barricades on the far side. Still, they pressed forward. A Passauer cavalryman charged ahead through the barricade and galloped into the streets of the old town, waving a pistol, but, seeing he was alone, he panicked and took off for the new town, where he was pulled from his horse and killed. While the local militias held the line at the bridge, a Protestant mob ran wild in the old town, looting the treasures of the Benedictine cloisters. Another mob invaded the cloister of Our Lady of the Snows and murdered any monks they could find. The church was ransacked and the altar destroyed, and then the Jewish quarter was attacked and pillaged. Fearing the whole town was tipping into bloody anarchy, the Protestant nobles took control, ordering the mob leaders to be arrested and imprisoned. And with that, the plundering came to a halt. The next morning, Protestant militias brought their artillery pieces forward to strengthen the old town's bridge defences. Unwilling to risk cannon fire, the Passauer mercenaries retreated into their positions on the other side of the river and refused to leave the city unless they were paid huge sums of silver. The blame for the disaster was, of course, sheeted home to Rudolf. The papal nuncio and the Spanish ambassador left Prague in disgust and went over to Matthias's camp. Peter Vock of Rosenberg, who had once been close to Rudolf, also switched his support to Matthias and agreed to pay off the mercenaries to be rid of them. Leopold and his Passauer army took the money and slunk out of Prague, leaving Rudolf's golden city streaked with blood. A fortnight after the departure of Leopold's mercenaries, Matthias and his army marched into Prague unopposed. The Protestant nobles and burghers voted to support Matthias as King of Bohemia, so long as he agreed to recognise the letter of majesty confirming their rights, which Matthias was happy to do. Rudolf was forced to abdicate the Bohemian throne, but was allowed to retain his imperial title and his occupancy of Prague Castle. Rudolf was still an emperor, but his tiny empire went no further than the walls of Hradčany. Legend has it that a shattered Rudolf stood at his window and uttered a terrible curse on the city. "Prague, ungrateful Prague, I have made you famous, but now you are driving me, your benefactor, out. Let revenge come upon you, and damnation befall you and all the Czechs." Alone and powerless, Rudolf was assailed with persistent bronchitis, and his legs became swollen with edema. He tried to treat his ailments by drinking an elixir containing amber and finely ground bezoar stones. The magic potion did nothing for him, and his legs became gangrenous. In January 1612, his servant brought him the awful news that his favourite lion, Muhammad, was dead. Rudolf remembered a horoscope given to him years earlier that predicted that he would share the lion's fate, and Rudolf died 3 days later on the 20th of January. His sarcophagus, garishly plastered with cherubs and crests, lies today in the vault of St. Vitus Cathedral. The second defenestration of Prague. Matthias, the new Holy Roman Emperor, had no great love for Prague. In 1612 he moved the imperial court back to Vienna, a decision that deeply offended Bohemians, who feared they were being downgraded to an Austrian outpost. The sudden departure of imperial councillors, bureaucrats, and foreign ambassadors from Hradčany left Praguers feeling cut adrift from the wider world once more. Matthias, who had connived for decades to replace his older brother, soon discovered he had won a hollow triumph. In Vienna, he realised he was seen by his family as a mere placeholder for a younger, more militant generation of Habsburgs waiting in the wings. The leader of this group was Archduke Ferdinand of Styria, a softly spoken, burning-eyed fanatic. As ruler of his southern Austrian domain, Ferdinand had moved from one town to the next, pulling down Protestant churches, making a bonfire of their hymnal books. He went so far as to dig up graves and strew the roads with Protestant corpses. It was he who had ordered the Protestant expulsions that had driven Johannes Kepler out of Graz. Better a desert, he had proclaimed, than a country full of heretics. Ferdinand bore a strong physical resemblance to Rudolf, the swollen Habsburg jaw, the sandy hair, the protruding lower lip. But Rudolf had been the figurehead of an open and tolerant age that was receding. Ferdinand, narrow and doctrinaire, was coming in on the new tide, ready to give the empire's unsteady framework of religious tolerance a good, hard kicking. Ferdinand saw this as a form of tough love. "Non-Catholics consider me unfeeling in my prohibition of heresy," he once told his Jesuit confessor. "I do not hate them, but love them. Unless I loved them, free from any concern, I would leave them in their error." When Matthias nominated Ferdinand as King of Bohemia, it put the Czech barons in a bind. Technically, it was they who were supposed to elect their king, but under the Habsburgs, this had become a mere formality, and they were gulled into accepting the obnoxious Ferdinand, even though he was known to be utterly hostile to their religious beliefs. Although Ferdinand had agreed to uphold the rights of the Protestants, once he was safely installed on the throne, he began to chip away at them. Freedom of speech was curtailed, and non-Catholics were again banned from high office. Discontent turned to outrage when Ferdinand's deputies in Prague ordered a Lutheran church in the town of Hroby to be torn down, and then jailed a local Protestant leader for speaking out against it. In May 1618, a group of radicalised Protestant nobles sent a list of grievances to the castle, but their letter was condescendingly dismissed by Ferdinand's Catholic deputies. On the morning of the 23rd of May, a delegation of Protestant nobles marched up to Hradčany at the head of an angry crowd to confront the arrogant officials. The procession, which was led by a Protestant nobleman and war veteran named Jindřich Thurn, entered the palace and barged into the small council chamber room, where they found the two most hated Catholic deputies, Vilém Slavata and Jaroslav Božita, seated at their desks. As the mob poured into the room, Slavata and Božita were pushed into a corner. Furious argument broke out as the deputies tried to defend themselves against a flurry of accusations. Then the mood turned murderous. The two Catholic deputies were seized by the arms and legs. At first they thought they were being arrested, but when they were dragged towards the window, they understood their fate. Božita cried, "Jesu Maria, help!" Then he was hoisted up and flung out the window. Slavata was also pushed out, but he clung on desperately to the sill. A rebel pounded his fingers with the hilt of a dagger, and the deputy released his grip, falling 20 metres to the ground below. The court scribe was thrown out the window too, for good measure. All three men were injured, but alive. The broken men limped and crawled away to safety, while the triumphant mob jeered and fired pistol shots from the window. Afterwards, the Catholics claimed the Madonna had interceded on the deputies' behalf by catching them and carrying them to the ground. The Protestants retorted that the men had only survived by landing in the huge heap of mouldering dung that sat at the foot of the window. The defenestration of the deputies was, of course, premeditated. Thurn and his followers were consciously reenacting the Hussite rebellion of 2 centuries earlier. The potent symbolism of Protestant defiance was irresistible. Just as Thurn intended, this second defenestration of Prague radicalised the participants and forced people to take sides. The Protestant nobles at once formed a Bohemian provisional government, which voted to raise an army of 16,000 men to be led by Jindřich Thurn. In Vienna, Ferdinand demanded that the emperor launch a crusade against the rebels in Prague, but an increasingly ill Matthias tried negotiation instead. In the months that followed, letters shot back and forth fruitlessly between Prague and Vienna, while both sides reached out for external support and prepared for war. The Habsburgs could count on military assistance from their cousins in Spain, as well as from the Catholic leaders of Bavaria and Poland. The Bohemian estates could only hope that Protestant rulers in Germany, England and Holland would come to the aid of their co-religionists. Emperor Matthias went to his grave on the 20th of March 1619, predicting terrible things would happen after his death. The Habsburgs, unwilling to concede an inch to the empire's Protestants, put forward Ferdinand to succeed Matthias as Holy Roman Emperor. Realising that compromise was now impossible, the Bohemian rebel barons took the fateful step of deposing Ferdinand as the King of Bohemia, and they offered their vacant throne to a young Protestant prince, Frederick V of the Palatinate of the Rhine. They hoped both he and his glamorous Scottish bride Elizabeth would rally all of Protestant Europe to their cause. Johannes Kepler had left Prague in despair after Rudolph's death, and he had taken up a position in Linz as a schoolteacher. Kepler completed the great star catalogue, the Rudolphine Tables, in 1623. But the Rudolphine moment, an era that had prized inquiry, contemplation and knowledge, died with its great patron in Prague Castle. The dream of spiritual unity was passing. The men of action were about to have their day, and the turmoil in Prague was about to drag all of Europe into the abyss. Kepler died in Regensburg on the 15th of November 1630, but the city's cemetery was later destroyed by marauding soldiers, and Kepler's bones were scattered. All we have left of his grave are the words he wrote for the inscription. It serves well enough as an epitaph for the whole Rudolphine era. I measured the skies, now the shadows I measure. Skybound was the mind, earthbound the body rests. Chapter 5. A Bohemia of the Soul. 2 Phoenixes. Frederick, Prince-Elector of the Palatinate of the Rhine, and his glamorous wife Elizabeth entered the rebel city of Prague on the 31st of October 1619. They were welcomed with an honour guard, cheering crowds, and streets decked out in blue and silver banners. Elizabeth made a good first impression on her new subjects by her eagerness to meet them, despite her advanced stage of pregnancy. But a few eyebrows were raised at her elaborate hairdo and plunging neckline. The couple were carried up to St. Vitus Cathedral, where they were crowned separately and solemnly as King and Queen of Bohemia. As the royal couple left the cathedral, they tossed newly minted silver coins to the crowd. Street parties broke out across Prague, and the fountains were filled with wine. Elizabeth was the daughter of King James I of England and Scotland. Her life up until this point had been like an enchanted dream. When her father had become king, she had been placed in the care of the doting Lord Harrington of Warwickshire, who created a miniature wooden village for her on his estate with an aviary and a menagerie stocked with the tiniest breeds of cattle from the British Isles. Elizabeth called this little zoo her fairy farm, and she appointed a family of peasants to be the keepers of her birds and beasts. The cost of the fairy farm nearly bankrupted Harrington. As Princess Elizabeth entered her teens, several royal suitors came forward to ask for her hand. Eventually, her family settled on Frederick, Prince Palatine of the Rhine, who was close to Elizabeth in age and religion. The couple met for the first time at Whitehall Palace in October 1612 and were instantly delighted with each other. They were both 16, good-looking, and earnestly Protestant, although they worshipped at different churches. He was a Calvinist, while she had been raised in the established Church of England. The wedding at Whitehall on St. Valentine's Day 1613 was an extravagant affair. Elizabeth's bridesmaids were adorned with so many jewels that their passage through the chapel was said to resemble the Milky Way. Despite the solemnity, Elizabeth was unable to stifle her giggling during the nuptial vows, which charmed the guests. The poet John Donne likened the married couple to two phoenixes whose joined breasts are unto one another mutual nests. The happy couple settled in at Frederick's palace in Heidelberg. They were by now deeply in love. Frederick constructed an elaborate Italian garden on the estate for her, and a house for her pet monkeys. When he was obliged to leave on business, they corresponded constantly, expressing their yearning to be reunited as soon as possible. Elizabeth would give birth to 13 children, and she was almost constantly pregnant throughout the course of their marriage. Their years in Heidelberg were to be the happiest of their lives. Frederick's sweet, sad eyes and affectionate nature endeared him to people, but he failed to inspire fear or command respect. The most one could expect of him, his teacher had remarked, was that he would duly follow honest advice. When the Bohemian estates terminated Habsburg rule and offered him their crown, Frederick was torn. His mother and his council of advisers emphatically urged him to refuse, as did the other German prince-electors, fearing that acceptance would ignite a religious war. His father-in-law, King James, was opposed to the idea as well. That might have been the end of the matter, but Frederick's ambitious chancellor, Christian of Anhalt, advised his prince to seize the day and accept his destiny as the saviour of Protestant Europe. Anhalt told Frederick that he had in his hands the means of overturning the world. By that he meant the Holy Roman Empire. The Bohemian crown would give Frederick a double vote in the Imperial Electoral College, handing the Protestants a 4-3 majority, and with it, the power to elect a non-Habsburg Protestant emperor. Publicly, Elizabeth proclaimed her neutrality on the issue, but privately she urged Frederick to make a queen of her. "I would rather eat sauerkraut with a king," she said, "than roast meat with an elector." Frederick agonised for weeks. Nothing in his young life had prepared him for such a momentous decision. After searching his conscience, he wrote to the Bohemians on the 28th of September to tell them that he would be their king. Frederick's acceptance of the Bohemian crown triggered a war of stupefying scale and intensity, which took 3 decades to run its course and left Central Europe a burnt-out ruin. In terms of human destruction, there would be nothing like it until the First World War. Between the years 1618 and 1648, 8 million people would die from violence, hunger and disease, mostly in the German lands. The populations of some regions of the Holy Roman Empire declined by 75%. This cataclysm, known as the 30 Years' War, was really a series of interconnected conflicts. It began as a civil war within the Holy Roman Empire, then it pulled in Spain, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and France. The whole thing was so complex and multifarious, with so many moving parts and conflicting allegiances, that it defies any attempt to make sense of it. British historian Veronica Wedgwood nonetheless summed up the horrifying pointlessness of it all. Morally subversive, economically destructive, socially degrading, confused in its causes, devious in its course, futile in its results, it is the outstanding example in European history of meaningless conflict. The mystery of the 30 Years' War is that the conflict was so harrowing and it lasted so long. And yet, at the outset, so few entered the fight with any real enthusiasm. But such was the foul feeling between people that no one could summon the energy to stop it. The kings and princes who entered the war cited different justifications at different times, depending on who they were talking to. It was one of the many paradoxes of the war that it should have been triggered by such a mild, well-meaning prince. As Frederick and Elizabeth settled into their new lives at Prague Castle, the outlook for the Bohemian Rebellion appeared to brighten. The noble estates of Austria, Moravia and Hungary declared their support. Denmark and Sweden and the Dutch Republic expressed their willingness to recognise Frederick as the legitimate king. Militarily, the rebels were on the offensive. Frederick's Hungarian allies took the city of Pressburg and then joined forces with Jindřich Thurn's Bohemians to lay siege to Vienna. For a dizzying moment, it seemed that the Bohemian rebels might prevail, until Ferdinand, who was now Holy Roman Emperor, turned it all around. The emperor reached out to Maximilian, the powerful Catholic prince of Bavaria. In return for his support, Ferdinand proposed that Maximilian could keep any part of Frederick's palatinate that he could take, and Frederick's electoral title along with it. Then, on the 22nd of November, the siege of Vienna had to be called off when the Hungarians rode off to defend their homeland against an invading army of Cossacks. By the end of the year, Frederick was looking like the leader of a lost cause. His natural allies began to edge away from him. In December, he called a meeting of the Protestant Military Alliance, the Evangelical Union, but hardly anyone bothered to show up. And despite Elizabeth's pleading, her father, King James of England, flatly refused to get involved. "There are some princes in Germany," he told Frederick's ambassador, "who wish for war in order that they may aggrandise themselves. Your master is young, and I am old. Let him follow my example." At the same time, Frederick and Elizabeth's popularity in Prague was plummeting. The Bohemians had hoped the couple would bring in great and powerful friends to aid their cause, but so far they had delivered nothing. Elizabeth's flamboyant clothes and her behaviour alienated her from her subjects, and the royal couple scandalised onlookers when Frederick bathed naked in the Vltava river for the amusement of Elizabeth and her ladies-in-waiting. Frederick had stumped up his own gold to pay for soldiers, but when he asked the Prague burghers to do the same, they refused, forcing the unpaid Bohemian army to pillage the countryside to feed itself. Frederick's enemies mocked him, nicknaming him the Winter King and Elizabeth the Winter Queen, because they were not expected to hold on to their crowns beyond a single season. Frederick's short reign in Prague entered its terminal phase when Ferdinand turned his fellow Protestant electors against him. John George, the Prince-Elector of Saxony, a cynical, hard-drinking Lutheran, saw Frederick as a gormless fool who had disturbed the peace. On the 20th of March, John George allied himself with Ferdinand and the Catholic League. An ultimatum was delivered to Frederick, ordering him to leave Bohemia by the first day of June. Frederick's final lifeline snapped when the Evangelical Union, of which he was nominally the head, declared their neutrality in the conflict. Abandoned by the princes and kings they thought they could rely upon, and unloved by their subjects, Frederick and Elizabeth awaited the final hammer blow. White Mountain. On the 26th of September 1620, the combined armies of Ferdinand's Catholic League and Maximilian's Bavarians crossed the Austrian border into Bohemia, led by Ferdinand's general, Count Johann Tilly. They overran western Bohemia without much difficulty, passing through a bleak landscape of empty villages and burnt-out farmhouses. Tilly's troops were hungry and exhausted, but Maximilian insisted they press on through the wet and cold towards Prague. Meanwhile, King Frederick's Protestant mercenaries, unpaid and on the verge of mutiny, prepared to defend the capital. Frederick's Chancellor turned General, Christian of Anhalt, ordered his men to set up a camp on a headland just outside Prague, known as White Mountain. The Battle of White Mountain conjures an image of an epic alpine fight to the death, but a visit to the battle site, a 30-minute tram ride from Prague Castle, brings it down to size. White Mountain is no snowy peak, but a flat, open field atop a long, low hill surrounded by suburban houses. It takes its name from its chalky soil. On the night of 7th of November 1620, Anhalt's unhappy Bohemian army barely bothered to throw up rudimentary breastworks along the ridgeline. Anhalt was aware that the enemy was nearby, but assumed that they were just as exhausted as his men, and he told Frederick he did not expect an attack the following day. Frederick left the camp to return to his pregnant wife and family in Prague. The Bohemians awoke on the 8th of November to a damp and misty morning. In the early dawn, Christian of Anhalt saw the Catholic armies advancing through the fog towards the slope of the hill. He ordered his forces to spread out along the ridgeline, with infantry and artillery in the centre and cavalry at the flanks. The 20,000-strong Catholic forces outnumbered the 15,000 defenders, but the Protestants held the high ground and could fire down on their enemies at the base of the hill. Nothing much happened for the rest of the morning, as Maximilian of Bavaria argued with his generals. Meanwhile, the imperial soldiers attended an open-air mass. A wild-eyed Carmelite priest, Padre Domenico, brandished a painting of the Nativity that he claimed had been desecrated by the Bohemian heretics. Stirred by this outrage, the soldiers looked up at the enemy on the ridgeline. Beyond them lay Prague and all its riches. At midday, 12 cannons boomed out from the imperial lines, signalling the Catholic infantry to advance up the hill. But instead of digging in and picking off the attackers from the high ground, Anhalt sent his cavalry charging down the slope. The Bohemian infantry was ordered into the fray, but seeing the bloody fighting, they stopped, fired a single volley of shots from a distance, then broke and ran from the field. Anhalt ordered a counterattack from a cavalry unit, which cut into the advancing Catholic line and pushed it back down the hill. General Tilly held his nerve and sent in his own cavalry veterans, led by Padre Domenico on horseback, who appeared through the smoke holding aloft a crucifix and the vandalised nativity scene. Tilly's horsemen attacked the weak Bohemian centre. The line broke and the defenders retreated in a wild panic. A single Dutch Protestant unit in the centre stood its ground until every one of them was cut down. By 2 o'clock, the Bohemian army was totally vanquished. After a pleasant lunch at Prague Castle, the Winter King was shocked to see his soldiers staggering through the city gates, covered in mud and blood. Christian of Anhalt then arrived at the castle and breathlessly told the royal family their army had been destroyed and they must flee the city at once. Frederick and Elizabeth packed up the children and the crown jewels in a fluster, but in the confusion they piled into their carriage without their young baby, which had to be retrieved and handed to them through the window. The short, inglorious reign of the Winter King and Queen was over. Neither would ever see Prague again. The rebel leaders in Prague tearfully surrendered to Maximilian of Bavaria, whose army entered the city unopposed. The imperial soldiers broke into the castle and helped themselves to the scattered silks, jewellery and firearms. Rudolph's letter of majesty, guaranteeing Protestant liberties, was discovered and sent to Vienna, where Emperor Ferdinand scornfully cut it to shreds. The emperor appointed new administrators in Prague, who drew up a list of enemies to be tried and condemned. When the death sentences were sent to Ferdinand for his approval, he blanched and fled the room. But the following morning, after a night of anguished prayer, he signed the documents. Temno. To the northwest of Prague, nestled in the fold of the St. Joachim Valley, lies the little spa town of Jakimov. In the year 1516, a Protestant noble, Count Stefan Schlick, was given a licence to mine silver there and to mint coins. The silver coin became known as the Joachimsthaler, which was simplified to thaler, and the name caught on. The Dutch minted their own silver pieces, called daalders, and brought them to North America, where they eventually gave their name to the world's benchmark currency, the United States dollar. The silver from the St. Joachim Valley made the Schlick family exceptionally wealthy and politically influential. Stefan's descendant, Count Andreas Schlick, had been among the Protestant nobles present when the Catholic regents were defenestrated from the castle window. After the defeat at White Mountain, his name was placed at the head of the list of men to be executed. On the 21st of June 1621, the condemned rebels were brought under guard into the old town square and led up to the scaffold. The square was packed with observers and guarded by hundreds of soldiers, swords at the ready, in case of a riot. The platform, erected next to the astronomical clock, was draped in black, with a 3-metre-high crucifix positioned in front of the executioner's wooden block, to ensure that that would be the last thing the condemned would see before lowering their heads. Drummers pounded out a tattoo to drown out any cries for mercy or shouts of defiance, while the executioner, wearing a red hood, stood by with 4 sharpened swords. Schlick, the first of the condemned, stepped up to the platform, knelt at the block, and put down his head. Then the edge of the blade was upon his neck, and it was all over for him. The second man to come forward was Dr. Jan Jasenius. In the years since he had performed that public autopsy in Retsek College, Jasenius had published several books on anatomy and medicine, and in 1616 he'd been elected rector of Prague University. As a distinguished Protestant scholar, Jasenius had undertaken several diplomatic missions on behalf of the Bohemian estates and had delivered a speech welcoming the Winter King and Queen to Prague. For that offence, his tongue was cut out before he was decapitated. Jasenius's body was quartered and his severed head impaled on a spike on the eastern tower of the Charles Bridge, along with the heads of other offenders. The doctor had been dismembered for talking too much, only a few blocks from where he had once conducted a dissection in the spirit of free inquiry. 12 nobles, knights and burghers were beheaded that morning. Another 15 rebels were hanged. The executed men are commemorated today by 27 white crosses embedded in the paving stones in front of the old town hall, next to the astronomical clock. The mass executions in the old town square amounted to a decapitation of Czech society and ushered in an era that Czech nationalists call Temno, the darkness, as Ferdinand scourged Bohemia of its heresy and remade Prague as a showcase city of the Counter-Reformation. Protestant clergy were banished and their chapels destroyed. Czech culture would also have to take a back seat. From now on, the German language would occupy the commanding heights of government and the bureaucracy, while Czech became the language of peasants and the urban poor. Prague University was placed under Jesuit control and later merged with the Clementium to form the Charles Ferdinand University. Prague's population dropped like a stone, from 60,000 to 40,000 and then 20,000. Ferdinand gave the remaining Protestant nobles a simple choice: accept the Catholic confession or go into exile. Flocks of Czech brethren slipped over the border into Germany rather than accept Catholicism in bad faith. John Amos Comenius, the author of a wonderful book called The Labyrinth of the World and the Paradise of the Heart, travelled to the Netherlands, where he became famous for his rational and compassionate teaching theories. Comenius was invited to become president of the newly founded Harvard University in the colony of Massachusetts, but he settled in Sweden instead. His exile felt like a chronic ache, just as it would for later generations of writers and intellectuals forced to leave Prague to escape a foreign despotism. Those who fled after the 1968 Soviet invasion saw the obvious parallels between themselves and the exiles of 1620. Locked out of their own country, living in faraway nations, they cultivated an inner garden of language, landscape and memory that author Joseph Skvoretsky called a Bohemia of the soul. Generalissimo. Ferdinand's new administrators in Prague established a special commission to confiscate the Protestants' land holdings and to parcel them out to their friends and accomplices at cut-rate prices. In the 2 years following White Mountain, more than half of Bohemia's total land area changed hands. It was the largest transfer of private property in Europe until the communist era. The sudden glut of empty, expropriated houses caused property prices in Prague to crash. At the same time, the local mint began issuing low-grade thalers debased with copper, so the property market was suddenly flooded with buyers willing to pay for land, but with the rubbishy new coins, which Ferdinand was obliged to accept at face value. The chief beneficiary of this windfall was not the emperor, but his military commandant in Prague, a man named Albrecht Schwaldsteiner, better known by his German name of Wallenstein. Wallenstein was born into a Czech Protestant family, but as a young man he abandoned the Lutheran Church to become a Catholic and a Habsburg loyalist. He served in the court of Emperor Matthias, and when war broke out, he brought a regiment of Moravian cavalry over to the emperor's side. The victory of the Catholic armies at White Mountain carried Wallenstein right into the centre of Bohemia's new ruling class. And the land confiscations allowed him to pick up nearly 60 estates at half price or less. With this newfound wealth, Wallenstein was able to fund his own loyalist army and to build a stupendous new residence in Prague. In 1623, he bought a long swathe of land just below the castle. 26 houses, 6 gardens and 2 brickworks were razed to the ground to make way for the Wallenstein Palace, one of the city's great Baroque treasures. Here the general and his guests could look out from its triple-arched terrace onto an Italianate garden filled with statues, bubbling fountains and manicured lawns with scratching peacocks. In the evenings, Prague's new elite could gather for concerts in the main hall under a gigantic ceiling fresco of the general, depicted as Mars, the god of war. Even the palace's stables were lavish. Each one of Wallenstein's 37 horses had its own painted portrait hanging in its box. Wallenstein spent little time in this oasis of peace, as he was constantly away at war, winning crushing victories against the Protestant armies. A grateful Ferdinand made him the Duke of Friedland and appointed him Supreme Generalissimo of his armed forces. In less than a decade, Wallenstein had risen from obscurity to command the largest army seen in Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. Wallenstein's contemporaries were in awe of his skill as a commander. His superstitious soldiers noticed that those around him always seemed to walk away from battle unwounded, and they concluded that Wallenstein carried some kind of mysterious protective aura around with him. Fighting had now broken out on several fronts. In 1624, the Protestant Netherlands entered the conflict, closely followed by Catholic Spain. A year later, Denmark came to the rescue of their fellow Lutherans in northern Germany, supported by English and Scottish troops. When Wallenstein knocked the Danes out of the war in 1629, the Emperor elevated him once again, making him Duke of Mecklenburg and General of the Oceanic and Baltic Seas. Wallenstein, standing at the head of a 100,000-strong army, was now a continental power in his own right, inspiring fear and dread in the Empire's German prince-electors. For years the princes had suffered the upstart general marching through their lands, and now that he had served his purpose and brought them close to victory, they pressed the emperor to dismiss him. In September 1630, Ferdinand bowed to their demands and sacked his most successful general. But his timing was disastrous. Thinking the end of the war was at hand, the overconfident emperor had issued a harsh new measure, an Edict of Restitution, which decreed that all lands taken over by Protestants since the Reformation be confiscated and restored to Catholic ownership. The edict alienated his few Protestant allies and goaded Sweden into joining the war, led by its warrior king Gustavus Adolphus, thereby prolonging the continental conflict for another 19 years. A furious Prince John George of Saxony defected from the imperial coalition, and in November 1631, his Saxon army invaded Bohemia and seized Prague. Ferdinand's administrators barely escaped the city in time. The Saxons expelled the Jesuits once again and took down the skulls of Jansenius and the other rebels from the bridge tower where they had sat for the past decade. In desperation, Ferdinand turned to the man he'd raised up and then cast aside. But Wallenstein extorted an extraordinary price for his return. He demanded that Ferdinand grant him the power to negotiate with the enemy as he saw fit. The emperor, pushed into a corner, had no choice but to hand over a prerogative that put his Czech general at the same diplomatic level as him. In a matter of months, Wallenstein raised a new 100,000-man army, and he pushed the Saxon army out of Prague. He fought the Swedes to a standstill at the bloody Battle of Lutzen in 1632, but then he retreated with his army into Bohemia and sat out the winter in his opulent palace in Prague. Wallenstein had become sick of the fanatical Ferdinand and weary of endless war, and he refused to pursue the enemy or lend assistance to his Bavarian allies. Instead, Wallenstein entered into negotiations with Yndrik Thurn, the Bohemian exile who had instigated the Second Defenestration and who was now serving as a Swedish general. Thurn told him that the Swedes had given up all hope of doing business with the fanatical Ferdinand, but, he suggested slyly, if a pragmatist like Wallenstein were to take the crown of Bohemia for himself, well then the prospects for peace would be so much better. In Vienna, the emperor and his court were deeply troubled by Wallenstein's refusal to move. Suspecting treachery, the emperor resolved to get rid of his dangerous general once and for all. And so, in February 1634, Wallenstein was charged with high treason. 5 days later, his officers kicked in his bedroom door and gutted him with their halberds. The fury of the Goths and the Vandals. As the war raged on, more states were drawn into the fighting. The mercenary armies fanned out across Central Europe like locusts. First, they devoured the farmers' food and fodder, and then the seed corn and the breeding animals, leaving towns, villages and farms to starve. Rumours of cannibalism circulated through the countryside. Plague broke out, leaving some towns and villages completely depopulated. A German chronicler observed, "How miserable is now the state of the large cities, where in former times there were 1,000 lanes, today there are no more than 100. How wretched is the state of the small and open market towns. There they lie, burnt, decayed, destroyed, so that you see neither roofs nor rafters, doors or windows. You travel 10, 20 or 40 miles without seeing a single human being." In 1635, after 17 years of war, starvation and plague, Ferdinand reached the painful conclusion that he could not reimpose Catholicism by force of arms, and he reluctantly signed a peace treaty with the Saxons at Prague Castle. The other Protestant German states signed up later, bringing the civil war within the empire to a close. But the Habsburgs' wider war dragged on. The French entered the conflict in the same year, not on the side of their Catholic co-religionists, but in coalition with the Habsburgs' Protestant enemies. The religious dimension of the conflict lost any meaning it may have had, as the war became a naked struggle between the French and the Habsburgs for European supremacy. Ferdinand II did not live long enough to see the end of the conflict. He died in 1637, leaving his burnt husk of an empire in the hands of his son, Ferdinand III. In the final phase of the war, the Swedish army twice invaded Bohemia. But the arrival of a Protestant force failed to spark much enthusiasm. A Swedish commander wrote, I had not thought to find the kingdom of Bohemia so lean, wasted and spoiled, for between Prague and Vienna all is razed to the ground, and hardly a living soul is to be seen in the land. In 1648, the representatives of the warring nations, having fought each other to a standstill, gathered at last in Westphalia, Germany, to bring the 30 Years' War to a close. As peace negotiations got underway, a Swedish army raced towards Prague, hoping to plunder what remained of its wealth before an armistice could be declared. The war's final act would be played out in the same city where it had begun 3 decades earlier. The Swedish invaders took Malá and Hradčany almost without a fight, and they went from house to house, seizing whatever they could find and murdering the inhabitants. Had they arrived 30 years earlier, the Protestant Swedes might have been greeted as liberators. Instead, citizens, burghers and students barricaded the eastern end of the bridge to keep the mercenaries out of the old town. The Swedes launched an artillery bombardment from the castle, while the Praguers hung on for 3 months, waiting for news of the peace settlement that would oblige the invaders to pack up and go home. Unable to cross the river, the frustrated Swedes had to settle for ransacking the castle palaces. Rudolph II's incomparable collection of paintings, statues and treasures were crated up and sent down the river in barges to be shipped off to Stockholm, where many of them remain to this day. The final signatures on the Peace of Westphalia were penned on the 24th of October 1648. In terms of religious boundaries, the signatories agreed on a return to the year 1624, not 1620, as the Czech Protestants would have dearly wished. Prague was to remain fixed as a Catholic city under tight Habsburg control. Those who had fled after White Mountain would remain in exile. 9 days later, news of the peace reached Prague, and the Swedes, laden with booty, made their way home. Today on the Charles Bridge, a commemorative plate, written in Latin, asks passers-by to take a moment to remember the defiant Praguers of 1648. Rest here, walker, and be happy. You can stop here willing. But here, unwilling, was stopped the fury of the Goths and the Vandals. Irregular pearls. A stillness fell upon Prague with the signing of the Peace of 1648. Some houses had been smashed by Swedish cannon fire, but the city's battered face had otherwise not changed very much in 30 years. The drastic population losses had left the streets quietened and houses emptied. The new emperor, Ferdinand III, decided to express his gratitude to Prague's citizens for their heroic stand against the Swedes by erecting a 14-metre column topped with a statue of the Virgin Mary. It was known as the Marian Column, and it was placed in the middle of the Old Town Square. While those who venerated the Mother of Christ were touched by the gesture, others saw this towering column as an act of propaganda, a massive Habsburg victory flag planted into the heart of the city. In Malá, the new Catholic administrators moved into the vacant mansions and set about remodelling them in the new style from Italy known as Baroque. The word came from the Portuguese word barroco, a jeweller's term that was used to describe an irregular, teardrop-shaped pearl. The new Baroque style was melodramatic and fussy, full of implied motion and tension. The Baroque, which appears so dramatic in the bright light and hard raking shadows of cities like Rome and Madrid, takes on a different tone in Prague. The pearlescent northern European light softens the hard edges. The gradients between light and shade are smoother. The style would become so prevalent in Prague that today all the other architectural forms seem to point to it or lead away from it. Prague's new Baroque buildings, monuments and churches were a world away from the elegant Renaissance structures of the previous era, the golden Schwarzenberg Palace on Hradčany Square, the dreamy Belvedere in the Royal Gardens, or the charming House at the Minute on the Old Town Square, covered in classical sgraffito. Under the Habsburgs, the new Baroque style became an instrument of propaganda and power. The liquid, writhing curlicues, the gilded edges, the arrayed statues gasping in agony and ecstasy were designed to impress and intimidate, as much as to inspire delight. There was no escaping the Prague Baroque. From 1683, some 30 stone and bronze saints sprouted up along the balustrades of the Charles Bridge like weird stone plants. Today, the bridge's avenue of saints is one of the glories of Prague, but in their time, those imposing stone sentinels must have struck an intimidating, even oppressive note for Praguers as they hurried across the Vltava. Black soup. The Italian architects and stonemasons who brought the Baroque to Prague were followed by Italian merchants who introduced the city to the pleasures of tailored clothing, fine food, red wine, olives and coffee. Coffee, or black soup, as it was sometimes called, was sold to the rich as a luxury item until a drop in prices made it an everyday pleasure. As public demand increased, an exotic figure in a hooded Arabic cloak could be seen wandering the streets of Malá selling coffee heated on a portable brazier. The man kept the sugar in his pockets. Giorgio Diodato was born in Damascus into an Assyrian Christian family. He'd come to Prague via Cairo and Rome, where he'd discovered a passion for coffee and for Western Roman Catholicism, which Diodato embraced with all the zeal of a convert. In 1714, after several years selling coffee in the street, Diodato established Prague's first coffee house, in the House of the Golden Snake, near the Charles Bridge. The snake emblem can still be seen on the corner of the building. Diodato's coffee house sold a range of exotic goods besides coffee: oranges, lemons, cinnamon, cloves, bergamot, chocolate and angelica water, a sweet-scented liquor believed to be an antidote to the plague. Many of Diodato's customers were Jewish, so he littered the cafe with books and Catholic pamphlets that he had written to helpfully direct the Jews towards the true Christian faith. Diodato wanted his customers to be in no doubt as to his loyalties. In 1716, to celebrate the birth of a son and heir to the emperor, Diodato redecorated the coffee house into a Habsburg fantasia. He hung portraits of the royal family in the windows, along with a smaller portrait of himself prostrate at their feet. Lest anyone question his religious allegiances, Diodato put up a picture of the Turkish Sultan cringing helplessly beneath the Habsburg eagle, crying out, "O Muhammad, help me!" One day, in 1713, a foreign visitor came into Diodato's cafe looking for help. Jacob Simon Toff was a Jewish businessman from Constantinople. He said he'd come all the way to Prague to be reimbursed for his efforts on behalf of the beleaguered Jews of Jerusalem. In the Holy Land, Toff explained, the impoverished Jewish community was being squeezed by the Ottoman governor to pay a jizya, a special tax that applied only to non-Muslims. but the Jews there had no money. Several rabbis had been arrested, and the authorities were threatening to burn down their synagogues unless they paid up. The desperate rabbis had sent emissaries to the Jewish diaspora, and Toph had come to the rescue. He had paid the steep ransom, which amounted to 300 gold ducats. In exchange, he received a promissory note signed by 16 Jerusalem rabbis, a note that guaranteed him full repayment of his gold from the most exalted rabbi in the world, the Prince of Israel, who happened to be living in Prague. David Oppenheim was Prague's chief rabbi, the leader of the largest Jewish community in Europe. On taking up the post in 1702, he was elected Nasi Be'eretz Yisrael, Prince of the Land of Israel, an honorific title that made him responsible for collecting funds to support the oppressed Jewish communities in the Holy Land. Oppenheim was a wealthy man and a great scholar. By the time he came to Prague, he had amassed the largest collection of Jewish books and manuscripts in the world. But the strict censorship regime in Bohemia made it impossible to bring the library with him to Prague, so he had left it in Hanover in the care of his son Joseph. When Jacob Simon Toph came to see him in Prague, Oppenheim readily repaid the 300 gold ducats. But the rabbi's note also stipulated that Toph would be entitled to a further payment of 1,200 florins for his expenses. Oppenheim gave him lodgings and a weekly stipend, but he shortchanged Toph on his expenses, offering him only 844 florins for his trouble. Toph was incensed by Oppenheim's meanness after he'd gone to all this trouble. Toph found his way to Giorgio Diodato's coffee house to ask for advice from a fellow Easterner. The coffee master at once agreed to act as an intermediary and interpreter when Toph decided to pursue the full amount owed to him through the courts in Prague. An outbreak of the plague delayed court proceedings for 4 years. In the meantime, Toph declared that he wanted to be baptized as a Christian. Giorgio Diodato was overjoyed and only too happy to be of assistance. Toph's conversion brought with it a shift in legal strategy. He and Diodato now argued that Oppenheim's payments of the Sultan's jizya had tipped a large sum of money from the Habsburg lands into the Ottoman treasury, a charge that amounted to treason. Toph produced his own promissory note in evidence to the magistrate's court. The case bumped along for 3 more years until the court found in favour of Oppenheim, and the rabbi was cleared of all charges. Toph and Diodato were incensed. They launched a series of appeals which eventually came to the attention of the Imperial Court in Vienna. A special investigation into the affair led to a decree. All collections on behalf of the Jews of Israel were now expressly forbidden. Furthermore, no one in the empire was permitted to hold the blasphemous title of Prince of Israel. The court gave thanks to Diodato for his role in exposing the Jewish intrigues, but his request for compensation was dismissed. The Oppenheim trial ruined Giorgio Diodato. He was required to pay court costs and damages that cost him his home and his coffee house. His wife Maria cast him out of the marital bed. "I no longer desire you," she said. "You have totally ruined us for the sake of imperial interests. So go to the emperor and let him help you." Diodato tried to escape his debtors by absconding to Germany and Austria, but he still owed money to Toph, and the two now became bitter enemies. After Toph's death, Diodato returned to Prague and threw himself on the mercy of the Old Town Council, who agreed to award him some money to help him set up another cafe. The councillors expressed their hope that the money might restore the happiness of the Diodato marriage, but it was not to be. Maria berated her husband in the coffee house as a fool. She refused to let him eat at the family table, forcing him to take his meals at the local orphanage. Diodato died in poverty and was buried at the Church of St. Thomas in Marlastrana. David Oppenheim died a revered member of his community. On his tombstone in the Jewish cemetery, he is remembered not as the Prince of Israel, which was now forbidden, but simply as a man among men. His vast repository of books and manuscripts was purchased by Oxford's Bodleian Library, where it remains to this day.
This is the end of CD 6. The book continues on CD 7.